far below the restless skin of the sea, beneath the silver shimmer of waves, beneath the paths of ships, beneath the drifting cries of birds. There are places the sun has never truly touched, places where morning does not arrive, places where color forgets its own name, places where the water grows so cold, so heavy, so still, that it begins to feel less like an ocean and more like a dream that has fallen asleep inside the earth. Most people imagine the deep sea as empty, a vast black wilderness, a silent grave of pressure and stone, a place where life should thin out, fade away, and quietly disappear. And yet, that is not the whole story, because hidden within that endless darkness, there are rare and secret places, where the seafloor breathes strange chemicals into the water, where invisible gases rise from cracks in the earth, where poison seeps upward through the mud, and where life, against every expectation, gathers close. Not around sunlight, not around warmth from the surface, not around forests of green, but around sulfur, around methane, around the cold, mineral breath of the planet itself. These are the toxic oases of the deep sea, silent gardens in a world without dawn, small kingdoms built not on light, but on chemistry, on darkness, on patience. And tonight, we are going there. We begin high above them, at the ocean's bright and familiar face, where the sea still flashes blue beneath the day, where waves curl and scatter light, and where the world still feels close to us. At first, the surface seems alive in a way we understand. The air moves, the water glitters, the horizon stretches open and calm. Everything here belongs to the old human language of day and distance. But the ocean is deeper than appearances. It always has been. So we leave the light behind, slowly, gently, as though drifting down through layers of sleep. The upper waters welcome us first. Soft blue surrounds us. The last gold traces of sunlight tremble overhead. Tiny particles drift in the current like dust in a cathedral window. For a little while, the descent feels peaceful, almost weightless. But the deeper we go, the more the world begins to simplify. Blue becomes darker blue, then ink, then something deeper than color. The warmth begins to fade. The pressure rises in silence, and the surface, with all its weather and brightness, becomes only a memory above us. Soon, even memory grows dim. This is the beginning of the midnight ocean, the great belt of dim water where sunlight weakens, breaks apart, and finally disappears. Here, the sea no longer sparkles. It absorbs, it hushes, it closes around you. There are no landscapes here in the way we know them. No trees, no clouds, no familiar ground, only descending water, cold and black and ancient, layer after layer, until direction itself begins to soften. Down here, life changes its methods. It learns new shapes, new hungers, new silences. Some creatures drift past like living glass. Some carry their own faint lanterns. Some vanish the moment you think you have seen them. But even these strange travelers are only hints, small whispers of what lies below. Because the deeper truth of the abyss is not just that creatures survive here, it is that whole communities can exist here, in places that should, by every simple rule, be barren. And the secret of those communities begins in the sea floor, far below us now, hidden under thick layers of mud and stone. The earth is never entirely still. It shifts, it presses, it releases. Deep within the crust, ancient organic matter breaks down. Chemical-rich fluids gather in darkness. Methane forms, sulfur compounds rise, and in certain places, over centuries, over ages, Those buried substances begin to escape upward, not in violent fountains, not always in heat, sometimes in a slow and almost ghostly way, a seep. A quiet leak from the planet's hidden interior. From a distance, such a place might look unremarkable. Just another patch of seafloor, just another stretch of sediment in the endless dark. But as we continue downward, and as our eyes adjust to this world without sunlight, a different picture begins to emerge. The bottom comes into view slowly, a suggestion at first. Then a dim plain of soft mud, flat, still, empty seeming. Yet something is different here. The sediment is marked by pale stains, white films, strange patches spread across the seafloor like frost in the night. There are clusters, shapes, faint towers, and delicate forms standing where no garden should ever grow. The place does not feel dead. It feels waiting, as though the darkness itself has been feeding something in secret, as though the earth below has opened a hidden table, and life, very quietly, has come to gather around it. No sunlight reaches this place, no green plant can bloom here, no dawn can warm it, and still, it lives. That is the mystery of the toxic oasis, not that it survives despite the dark, but that it has made the dark its home. Here, poison is not always poison. Here, what would suffocate one form of life becomes nourishment for another. Here, the rules of the surface loosen their grip, and the old, deep laws return, the laws of chemistry, the laws of pressure, the laws of silence. And as we hover above this first pale seep field, watching ghostly mats spread over the mud, watching the first signs of an unseen ecosystem appear beneath us, we begin to understand something rare and humbling. The ocean does not need sunlight to create wonder. Sometimes, in its oldest and darkest places, it builds entire worlds from the things we fear most, from cold, from pressure, from poison, from the breath of the buried earth. And this is only the beginning of our descent. We drift lower still, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the soft, steady surrender of something falling through sleep. Above us now, the upper ocean is gone. No blue remains, no silver, no trembling memory of day. There is only the deep water, wide and black, holding us in its patient, ancient silence. Below, the seep field stretches farther than it first appeared. What seemed from a distance like pale stains upon the mud now begins to unfold into patterns, curving streaks of white, soft, milky films spread across the seafloor, clusters of shells, thin pillars rising out of the darkness like forgotten ruins. Nothing here looks accidental. Every patch of white, every faint shimmer in the sediment, every strange growth anchored to the earth, speaks of a hidden process still at work beneath the floor below us. Somewhere under this calm plain, methane is slipping upward through buried layers of mud. Hydrogen sulfide seeps from the earth in slow exhalations. Mineral-rich fluids move through unseen fractures, and where those chemicals meet the freezing seawater above, an invisible bargain begins. This is where the first architects of the oasis appear. They are too small for the human eye to love easily, too simple to notice from afar. No flowing fins, no watchful gaze, no graceful movement through water, only microbes, bacteria and archaea, minute beings clinging to stone, sediment and seeping fluid, quietly doing what no surface forest could do here. They take the chemicals rising from the deep earth and turn them into energy. Not sunlight into sugar, not leaf into life, but sulfur into survival, methane into matter, darkness into food. It is one of the strangest revolutions in all the sea. On the surface, nearly every living thing is tied, however distantly, to the sun. The green world above catches light, and from that light entire chains of hunger begin. But here, at the toxic oasis, another chain is born. A chain with no dawn at its source. This is chemosynthesis, a word almost too clinical for something so quietly astonishing, because what it truly means is that life has found another fire to gather around. Not a fire of flame, not a fire of warmth, but a chemical fire, slow and unseen, burning inside the dark logic of the earth itself. The white mats that cover the sediment are part of that living foundation. They spread like frost over the mud, soft, pale, ghostly, a skin of microscopic workers feeding on seeped chemicals. They do not glow, they do not sing, they do not move in any way we would call beautiful. And yet, they are the beginning of everything here. Without them, the oasis would be only mud and poison. With them, it becomes a table laid in the abyss. Around these microbial fields, larger lives begin to gather. At first, only shells, pale clusters half buried in sediment. Some lie open like sleeping mouths, others remain tightly sealed, holding soft life within hard walls. These clams and mussels seem still, almost lifeless, but inside them another secret is kept. Many deep-sea seep mollusks do not survive by ordinary feeding alone. Within their tissues live symbiotic bacteria, tiny chemical makers housed like honored guests. The animal gives them shelter. The microbes turn seeped chemicals into nourishment. Together, they become something greater than either could be alone. It is a partnership, older than our imagination feels prepared to hold, a creature of flesh, trusting its hunger to invisible companions. The deeper we look, the stranger the seafloor becomes. Tube worms rise in clusters nearby, long, pale bodies sheathed in delicate tubes, their soft plumes extending into the water, like crimson flowers in a moonless garden. They have no mouths in the usual sense, no jaws, no teeth, no simple hunt. Inside them, too, live bacteria, hidden partners transforming chemistry into life. The worms stand motionless in the current, not like hunters, not like wanderers, but like the still vegetation of some impossible underwater field. If you did not know better, you might think this place peaceful. A silent meadow in the abyss, a garden arranged by careful hands. But peace is not the same as gentleness. The fluids rising here can be toxic. The chemistry that feeds one creature can poison another. Hydrogen sulfide, especially, is lethal to most familiar forms of life. It interferes with the machinery cells used to breathe. To surface animals, it is the breath of death. Yet here, that same breath sustains entire colonies. This is what makes the oasis feel almost unreal. It is not merely life in darkness, it is life reinterpreting danger itself, turning harm into habitat, turning poison into cradle. The mud beneath us is not uniform now. We can see subtle ridges, collapsed pockets, darker streaks where seepage has altered the sediment. Sometimes bubbles escape in slow, trembling bursts, small silver beads of methane lifting briefly into the water before dissolving into invisibility. Even the ground seems alive with hidden conversation. There are crusts here too, hard mineral formations laid down over long ages as seep fluids meet seawater and transform. Carbonates build slowly, patiently, into ledges and chimneys and irregular stone outcrops. These become anchor points for new communities, places for worms to cluster, for shell beds to grow, for scavengers to creep in from the surrounding plain. What began as a leak becomes a landscape, and what began as chemistry becomes an ecosystem. We move carefully over the seep field, our lights sliding across pale bacterial mats, shell mounds, and tube worm towers. Every few meters the scene changes. One patch looks almost barren, another blooms with strange abundance. It is as if the deep sea has hidden islands here, small bright pockets of life in a continent of black. Beyond the edges of the seep, the plain darkens again. The mud grows emptier. The density of life fades. The shells thin out. The white mats vanish. And that contrast tells the whole story. The oasis is real because the emptiness around it is real. These creatures are not merely thriving in darkness. They are clustering around a rare exception. A deep earth gift, a chemical opening in an otherwise starved world. We hover there for a moment, suspended above one of the oldest survival strategies on Earth. Older, perhaps, than forests, older than birdsong, older than anything the surface ever taught us to call alive. And slowly, very slowly, another feeling begins to settle over the scene. Not fear, not exactly, but awe of a quiet and difficult kind. Because this place asks us to imagine a world where life did not wait for sunlight. A world where existence learned to feed on the wounded breath of the planet and found enough there to endure. In the black stillness of the seep field, surrounded by pale worms, buried clams, and ghostly microbial snow, the deep ocean offers its first true lesson, that life is far more patient than our rules, far stranger than our comfort, and far more willing to bloom in forbidden places than we ever dreamed. As we continue over the seep field, the silence deepens into something almost ceremonial. Nothing rushes here, nothing startles in the way surface life startles. There are no crashing waves, no wind-torn branches, no sudden chorus of birds breaking from a hidden grove, only the slow pulse of the abyss, only drifting particles falling through black water like soft ash from a fire no one can see. And yet, the oasis is not still. It only moves at the speed of deep time. A pale crab appears first, so softly that it seems less to arrive than to become visible. Its legs press carefully into the sediment. Its body is almost white, as though color itself has been worn away by generations without sunlight. It does not scuttle with the sharp panic of shallow crabs. It glides in pauses, testing the ground, tracing the edges of the bacterial mats, as if reading a message hidden in the mud. This is one of the smaller keepers of the seep field, a scavenger, a grazer, a patient visitor to the chemical garden. Nearby, another shape rises from the dark, longer-limbed, more delicate, a ghostly shrimp drifting just above the bottom. Its body is translucent in places, almost glass-like. Its movements are spare and exact. A slight tilt, a faint lift, then stillness again. Here, energy is precious. Nothing is wasted on unnecessary grace. Every motion has the feeling of an old decision. The more we watch, the more the seep field reveals its layered lives. Tiny worms thread through the sediment, small snails cling to mineral crusts, amphipods flicker at the edges of our light, brief, restless shadows feeding where they can. A fish hovers above the ground for a moment, soft-bodied and pale, then vanishes back into black water beyond the colony. No single creature rules this place. That is part of its mystery. On the surface, we are used to landscapes with obvious masters. forests with towering trees, grasslands with great herds, coral reefs bright with impossible abundance. But the toxic oasis is built differently. It is a quieter kind of kingdom, a layered economy of invisible work, a republic of microbes and symbionts, a place where giants are rare, and survival belongs to those who can endure the chemistry of the seep. Even the predators here feel restrained by the mood of the abyss. From behind a carbonate ridge, a larger shape begins to move. At first, it seems to be only shadow, a slight thickening of darkness sliding along the seafloor. Then the beam catches it, a deep-sea fish, its head broad, its mouth low and waiting, its body heavy with the stillness of an animal that has learned not to waste hope. It does not chase, it does not strike, it waits. That, too, is a deep-sea lesson. In a place where food may come rarely, where every chance must be measured, patience becomes a kind of weapon. The fish hovers near the edge of the seep community, where smaller animals pass between shelter and open mud. Its eyes are dark, unreadable. Its body seems almost sculpted from the dim water around it. And for a long moment, it simply remains there, like another stone in the field. Perhaps that is how life survives in the abyss, not by dominating the darkness, but by becoming fluent in it. All around us, the ecosystem continues its hidden exchanges. The tube worms hold their red plumes into the water, gathering what their bacterial partners need. The clams remain buried and still, their soft interiors alive with unseen chemistry. Crabs graze the microbial mats, shrimp pick through seep-stained ground, scavengers arrive from the surrounding plain, drawn by a richness that does not exist anywhere else nearby. And under it all, the seep continues, slow, cold, persistent. Methane moves upward from buried depths. Hydrogen sulfide leaks through sediment. Bacteria feed, minerals harden, shells gather. Death settles, life answers. The whole field feels less like an accident and more like a conversation between the earth and the sea. A whisper rising from below, a reply forming above. There is something ancient about that exchange, something that reaches beyond the modern ocean, beyond whales and reefs and tides, into an older planet. A harsher planet? A younger world where life may first have learned how to endure. Some scientists have long wondered whether places like this echo the earliest conditions of life on Earth. Not in exact form, not as perfect windows into the past, but as reminders. Reminders that life may not have begun in comfort, that it may not have waited for clear skies and shallow lagoons, that its first courage may have been born in darkness, among minerals, heat, chemistry, and stone. And when you hover over a cold seep long enough, that idea no longer feels abstract. It feels present, because this place does not seem like a later adaptation. It seems foundational, as though somewhere deep in the memory of the planet, life still remembers how to live this way. The creatures here are strange to us, but perhaps not strange to the earth. Perhaps this is one of the old languages of survival, a language spoken before leaves, before feathers, before the open blue became the stage we know. The pale crab continues its slow path beside a bacterial mat. The shrimp lifts and turns. A snail traces a mineral edge. The waiting fish remains almost motionless in the dark. Each life is small. Each life is quiet and still together. They make the oasis feel immense, not because it is large, but because it changes the meaning of emptiness. The abyss around it is vast, and hungry. Black water stretches in every direction. Cold mud plains disappear into distance. The weight of the ocean presses from above with endless, indifferent force. And yet here, in one seep field among countless miles of darkness, there is a gathering, a hidden economy, a soft congregation of lives that have found a way to turn the Earth's buried poison into home. That is what makes the scene feel almost sacred. Not holy in the human sense, not touched by gods or rituals or names, but sacred in the older sense, marked by endurance, made precious by improbability, protected by darkness itself. And as our lights drift farther across this strange garden, catching pale claws, red plumes, white shells, and the soft, drifting dust of the deep, we begin to feel that we are not merely observing a habitat, we are trespassing gently through one of the ocean's hidden answers, an answer to hunger, an answer to poison, an answer to the ancient question of whether life can survive where light cannot follow. Here in the seep field, the answer is yes, quietly, patiently, beautifully, yes. Beyond the brightest cluster of worms and shells, the seep field begins to change. The white microbial mats grow thinner here. The sediment darkens. The mineral crusts become rougher, more broken, as though the seafloor itself has been breathing for so long that it has started to leave ruins behind. We move slowly over one of these carbonate outcrops, a hard, irregular formation built grain by grain through ages of seepage. It rises from the mud like the remains of a drowned wall. Its surface is uneven, pitted, layered with the silent work of chemistry, and all across it, small lives have taken hold. Tiny snails cling to its edges, pale limpets rest in shallow hollows. Worms thread through the cracks. Delicate films of bacteria spread over stone as if painting the rock with a living frost. Nothing here was built quickly. That is one of the first truths the deep sea teaches. Its wonders are not rushed into existence. They accumulate, slowly, patiently, in darkness so complete that no eye witnesses the process. The seep itself is like that. No single dramatic eruption, no violent opening in the crust, just the long release of buried chemicals, the quiet passage of methane and sulfides through ancient layers of mud, the endless shaping of stone by fluids that should have remained hidden below. And because the process is slow, the life that gathers here also learns slowness. A crab climbs over the carbonate ridge, each step careful, each pause deliberate. Its pale body blends with the mineral surface until only movement reveals it. For a moment it stops near a narrow fissure in the stone, as though sensing something within. Perhaps the seep is stronger there, perhaps a thin current of chemical-rich water still escapes through that crack. Perhaps the crab has learned, in its own quiet way, to recognize where the invisible table is richest. Not all seeps are the same. Some are weak and scattered. Some are active enough to gather dense communities. Some fade with time, their chemical gift diminishing, their living colonies thinning until the oasis returns to plain dark mud. Others endure for centuries, sometimes longer. That means a cold seep is not only a place, it is a chapter, a temporary opening in the deep, a window of abundance in a world of scarcity, a hidden season that may outlast generations of the creatures feeding there, but still, in the scale of the earth, remain only a passing breath. This makes the seep field feel even more fragile. Not fragile in the shallow waterway, not bright and easily broken like coral in warm, tropical light, but fragile in a deeper, sadder sense. A hidden world sustained by a condition so specific, so patient, that if the chemistry slows, the entire garden begins to dim. The tube worm towers ahead of us stand taller here, their red plumes like soft flames against the black. But even among them, there are signs of change. Some tubes are empty, some lean and darken, some lie broken across the mud as if an older colony has already begun to fall silent. Death is always present in the oasis, not as interruption, not as failure, but as part of the exchange. Shell beds build from long generations of clams that once fed here. Mineral structures rise around creatures that have already vanished. Scavengers move through the remains. Bacteria continue their work beneath the surface. The seep does not pause for grief. It simply continues, and life arranges itself around what is still given. In that way, the toxic oasis resembles an ancient city more than a meadow. There are foundations, there are occupied districts, there are quiet outskirts, there are ruins from earlier phases of abundance, and beneath everything, there are unseen systems still shaping the lives above. As we drift farther, the lights reveal a patch of sediment disturbed by slow bubbling. Tiny beads of methane rise through the mud, one after another, small, trembling spheres lifting from the Earth's interior. For a moment, they catch the light like scattered pearls, then vanish into the black water above. It is a strange thing to witness, a gas born in deep burial, travelling upward through layers of silence, finally escaping into the sea after centuries, perhaps longer, only to disappear almost instantly from sight. The deep ocean is full of such fleeting revelations, things that take ages to arrive and only seconds to be lost. Perhaps that is why these places feel dreamlike, not because they are unreal, but because they are real in a way our ordinary lives rarely are. Slow to form, easy to miss, unafraid of silence. The creatures here seem shaped by that same philosophy. A shrimp hovers over a seep crack, its body translucent, its limbs fine and careful. A small fish passes through our beam and is gone. A cluster of mussels lies half buried nearby, their shells dark against the pale sediment, each one holding inside it an invisible alliance with bacteria. Everywhere we look. Life is built on relationship, not independence, not conquest, but partnership. The clams need their symbionts. The worms depend on internal bacteria. The bacterial mats depend on seep chemistry. The scavengers depend on the colony. The predators depend on the margins of abundance. Nothing here thrives alone. That may be the second great lesson of the toxic oasis. The first was that life can bloom without sunlight. The second is that in the deepest darkness, survival often becomes a form of cooperation so intimate, so complete, that one life begins inside another. This idea feels almost too beautiful for a place built from poison. And yet perhaps beauty is always strongest where it was least expected. Above us, the water remains empty-looking, vast and black and calm, but the seafloor beneath keeps offering detail after detail, signs that this is not a lonely patch of mud at all. It is a living threshold, a borderland between the buried earth and the open sea. That is why the seep communities often feel so different from the surrounding abyss. They are fed from below rather than above. Most ocean life, in some distant way, still depends on the rain of organic matter sinking from surface waters, tiny fragments of dead plankton, falling detritus, marine snow descending through darkness. But here, the meal rises upward. Energy does not drift down from the sunlit world. It leaks up from the hidden world below. This reversal changes everything. It makes the oasis feel older than the sea above it, more secret, more rooted in the planet's interior than in its skin. And as we pass over broken carbonate, empty worm tubes, bubbling seep cracks, and active colonies glowing pale in our lights, we begin to understand that this place is not just a habitat, it is a boundary made visible, a place where two worlds meet, the cold ocean above, the chemical earth below, and between them, life, patient life, strange life, life that has learned to drink from the invisible wounds of the planet and turn them into a hidden garden no sunlight has ever seen. We drift onward, deeper into the field, while behind us the quieter colonies fade into darkness again. Ahead, something larger waits near the edge of the worms, a heavier shadow, a slower shape. The oasis is about to show us another face. At first, the shadow ahead seems motionless, too broad to be a worm cluster, too low to be stone, too deliberate to be only darkness arranging itself by chance. We drift closer. The lights reach across the seafloor, sliding over broken carbonate, over white bacterial film, over shell beds and red-plumed towers, until at last the shape resolves into flesh. A fish, heavy-bodied, broad-headed, resting just above the mud with the patient stillness of something that has lived a long time in places without hurry. Its skin is pale in some places, darker in others, as if it has borrowed its colors from the seep itself. Chalk from the bacterial mats, shadow from the surrounding abyss, a muted body made to disappear between colony and dark plain. It does not flee from the light, it does not rush toward us, it simply watches. There is something deeply unsettling and deeply calm about a predator that has abandoned the drama of pursuit. In the upper ocean, movement often means survival, speed, agility, escape, chase. But here in the toxic oasis, where food is precious and energy cannot be squandered, patience becomes a more powerful design than speed. The fish waits at the border of abundance. That border matters. Closer to the worms and clams, life is dense by abyssal standards. There are grazers on the bacterial mats, shrimp moving delicately among cracks, small scavengers testing the ground, soft-bodied animals passing from one patch of shelter to another. Beyond that border, the open mud begins again, dark, quiet, sparsely inhabited. The predator has chosen the perfect threshold. It holds itself at the place where hunger is most likely to arrive. We hover a little higher and let the scene settle around us. The fish barely moves, only the faintest adjustment of fins, the slightest opening and closing of the mouth, the slow exchange of water over hidden gills. Its eyes are dark, reflective in our beam for only an instant, not expressive in any human way, not cruel, not kind, only present. In the deep sea, presence is often enough. A small shrimp drifts too far from the shelter of a seep crack. For one heartbeat, it hangs in the water column, light catching its translucent body. Then the predator moves, not fast in the shallow water sense, no sudden burst of silver violence, no bright spray of bubbles or sand, just a compact, precise advance, a single decision made visible, and then stillness again. The shrimp is gone, the fish returns to waiting. It is over so quietly that the seafloor itself seems not to notice. This too is part of the hidden order of the oasis. It is easy, from afar, to imagine such places as peaceful merely because they are silent. But silence is not mercy. Silence is only the way deep life conducts its business. Predation lives here, just as symbiosis lives here, just as scavenging and decay and chemical transformation live here. The toxic oasis is not a sanctuary from the old laws. It is simply a different arrangement of them. Life feeds on chemistry. Creatures feed on life. Death settles into sediment. Microbes continue their unseen work, and slowly, endlessly, the deep turns every exchange into another layer of the system. A pale, eel-like body appears from beneath a ledge of carbonate nearby, slipping forward with such smooth restraint that it feels almost liquid. Its form is long, its movements spare, its skin touched by the same dim pallor shared by so many creatures below. It explores the edge of the colony, not in panic, not with boldness, but with the strange composure of an animal perfectly fitted to scarcity. Perhaps that is what makes the seep fauna feel so dreamlike. They do not behave like creatures in a rich world. They behave like thoughts moving through a narrow chamber of necessity. Every motion is weighed, every pause is meaningful, every drift from safety carries consequence. And yet the oasis continues to glow softly with abundance relative to the plain around it. Another crab appears, larger than the first, crossing an old bed of shells that crunch invisibly beneath its careful steps. Its claws touch the sediment, lift, and touch again. It pauses beside a broken worm tube, then continues toward a white patch of bacteria where the mud seems richer. There is no wasted aggression in it, no shallow water bravado. Even the scavengers here seem disciplined by the abyss. That discipline extends to the whole colony. The tubeworm plumes open into the current like dark, red flowers. The mussels remain sealed and patient. Bacterial mats spread with quiet certainty over seep-fed ground. Predators linger at the edges. Scavengers comb the remains. Above it all, marine snow drifts downward from the distant world of light, a faint reminder that the surface still exists somewhere far beyond the black ceiling overhead. But the seep community does not depend on that faint snowfall, the way most of the deep sea does. That is what makes it so extraordinary. This is not merely a place where life makes do with scraps. It is a place where the earth itself provides a second source of energy, a hidden income of chemistry, a buried wealth leaking upward into the abyss. And where there is energy, there will always be structure. Not just food webs, but territories, margins, waiting places, moments of risk. The predator before us belongs to that structure just as much as the worms do. It is not separate from the oasis. It is shaped by it, dependent on it. A later note in the same song, that idea changes the way the whole scene feels. The toxic oasis is not simply a patch of life on the ocean floor. It is an entire logic, an alternate order of existence, a way for the planet to build complexity in darkness, beginning with invisible microbes and ending, eventually, in watchful hunters at the edge of the colony. For a while we remain there, suspended between the patient fish and the pale towers of worms behind it. Nothing else moves except the slow drift of particles. Nothing speaks except the silence of pressure. And in that stillness, the oasis takes on a new character, no longer only a garden, no longer only a hidden refuge. Now, it feels like a complete world, a world with its own producers, its own grazers, its own scavengers, its own predators, its own ruins, its own borders, its own laws. A world built without sunlight, a world fed by poison, a world so unlike our own that it almost seems impossible, and yet so orderly that it feels somehow inevitable. Perhaps wherever energy gathers, life will learn to surround it. Perhaps wherever the planet leaks even a little possibility into darkness, something will come to meet it. The fish finally turns away from our light, slowly, its body dissolving back into the black margin beyond the seep. One moment it is there, the next it is only suggestion, shadow, returning to shadow. And as we drift onward over broken shells and white microbial fields, we understand that the oasis is far larger than any single colony. This was only one border, one threshold, one arrangement of life around a chemical gift. Ahead, the seafloor lowers again, and the worm towers begin to thin. The oasis is leading us toward another region now, a place where the chemistry grows stranger, and the deep begins to resemble not a garden, but the ruins of another planet. Or the seep field changes gradually, so gradually that for a while it is hard to say where one region ends and another begins. The tall red-plumed worms behind us grow fewer now. The shell beds lie more scattered. The white bacterial mats no longer spread in soft, unbroken sheets, but gather in torn patches, like frost left behind on stones after a long and silent winter. Ahead, the seafloor becomes harsher. Carbonate ridges rise from the mud in crooked lines. Broken chimneys lean at strange angles. Dark fissures cut through pale sediment. The ground looks older here, more exposed, more wounded by the chemistry rising from below. If the earlier colonies felt like hidden gardens, this place feels like a ruin, not empty, not dead, but ancient in mood, a landscape shaped by slow exhalations of the earth, built grain by grain, layer by layer, until the abyss has learned to wear the face of forgotten stone. We drift above one long mineral ledge, its surface rough with deposits left by seep fluids meeting seawater over uncounted years. In places it looks almost architectural, like a collapsed wall, like the remains of pillars half swallowed by mud, like the foundation of some drowned structure no human mind was meant to remember. And perhaps that is why the deep so often invites fantasy, not because it is false, but because it is real in forms so unfamiliar that the imagination reaches for lost cities, buried temples, and vanished worlds, simply to keep pace with what the eyes are seeing. Here, in the toxic oasis, those illusions come easily. A ridge of carbonate arches upward like the spine of some sleeping creature. A line of hollow tubes rises beside it like toppled columns. Clusters of mussels gather in the shadows between stone outcrops, their shells dark and still, as if waiting for a tide that never comes. Nothing is truly abandoned, and yet everything carries the beauty of abandonment. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of the seep world. It is rich with life, but it often looks like aftermath. The chemicals rising here sustain whole communities, and at the same time, they alter the ground, stain the mud, harden the minerals, and leave behind structures that resemble decay. Creation and corrosion happen together. The bacterial films cling to stone like pale breath. Methane seeps through fissures we cannot fully see. Hydrogen sulfide lingers in the sediments below, and the creatures living here arrange themselves around that chemistry with a precision that feels both delicate and severe. A crab crosses one of the broken ledges beneath us. Its pale body flashes in the light, then dims again. It pauses beside a patch of milky bacteria, touches the ground with one claw, then moves on. Farther ahead, a cluster of mussels lies packed so tightly together that they seem almost fused into the rock. They form dark, layered mounds, small cities of shell held in place by a hidden income of seepage below. Inside them, the old partnership continues, invisible bacteria turning chemicals into nourishment, animal life depending on inner alchemy. The same impossible agreement repeated again and again across the field, and beyond them, the seafloor opens into a zone even stranger still. The sediment there is paler, almost chalky, in our lights. Not smooth but crusted, as though the mud itself has been transformed by what rises through it. There are broken patches where the ground looks brittle, cracked, delicate, a skin over something restless beneath. We move lower. A faint shimmer appears near the bottom. Not a glow, not true light, but a wavering distortion where seep fluids alter the water just above the ground. It is subtle, easy to miss, yet once seen, it changes the whole feeling of the place. This is not merely landscape. This is process. The oasis is not finished. It is being made, even now, in darkness, under pressure, without witness. That thought brings a different kind of awe. On the surface, so much of life seems to happen in open display. Leaves unfurl in sunlight, clouds gather where we can watch them. Waves break in the open air, even storms announce themselves. But the deep earth works in secrecy. Its gases gather in burial, its fluids move through hidden faults. Its seepage shapes ecosystems no dawn has ever touched, and all of it continues whether anyone sees it or not. Perhaps that is why these places feel sacred. They do not need attention to become extraordinary. They remain extraordinary in private. A long, pale fish slips between two carbonate blocks, its body so thin and calm that it seems like a ribbon of the abyss itself. It does not linger in the open. It threads through the structures, vanishing into a dark seam where bacterial mats spread over stone. Elsewhere, brittle stars cling to the edges of rock, their arms curled in patient geometry. Tiny life threads through every crack. Worms hidden in sediment, snails on mineral crusts. Small crustaceans moving like thoughts at the edge of vision. This is no empty ruin, it is a living ruin, an architecture of seepage and survival, a world in which stone, poison, and life are braided so tightly together that none can be understood alone. And as we hover there, above these broken chimneys and pale crusts, it becomes easy to imagine the earliest earth. Not the green earth of forests, not the blue earth of calm seas, but the harsher one, the young one. A planet still restless with chemistry, still speaking more in minerals than in leaves. Places like this seem to remember that planet. They remember a time when life may have had to begin with darkness as its cradle, when sunlight was not the obvious answer, when survival meant learning to read the language of rock, of sulfide, of methane, of hidden heat and unseen gradients. Whether or not the first life truly began in places like these, the possibility lingers here like a ghost, because everything about the toxic oasis feels original, not modern, not secondary, but deeply old, as if the abyss has preserved one of creation's first rough drafts and hidden it beneath miles of water. The chimneys beside us are not volcanic towers, not blazing vents. These are colder structures, patiently assembled by seep minerals over long spans of time. But in their stillness they feel almost more haunting than fire. They look like monuments built by chemistry alone, monuments no one intended, monuments no one named, and yet around them life has gathered, fed, waited, reproduced, died, and fed the system again. It is impossible not to feel humbled here. The surface world often teaches us to think of life as fragile because it needs so much light, warmth, oxygen, balance. But the seep field teaches a harder lesson. Life is fragile in some ways and shockingly stubborn in others. Give it even a narrow opening, a thin chemical current, a seep through buried mud, and it may build an entire hidden civilization. In response, we continue forward over the ruined mineral plain, our lights trailing over cracks, shell mounds, pale films, and dark waiting gaps between the stones. Somewhere ahead, the chemistry is shifting again. The ruin-like beauty of the oasis is giving way to something softer, something broader, as though the deep is preparing to show not just how life survives here, but how entire fields of hidden abundance can bloom in the cold breath of the earth. And slowly, very slowly, the seafloor begins to open. The seafloor opens before us with such quiet softness that at first it feels less like entering a new region and more like waking inside a different dream. The broken ledges and chimney-like ruins begin to fall behind. The hard mineral shapes sink into the black distance. In their place, the bottom grows broader, smoother in some stretches, and yet more densely marked by life. What spreads ahead is not a single colony, not one cluster of worms or one bed of mussels, but a field, a vast, pale field. The sediment here is streaked with white and silver tones beneath our lights. Microbial mats stretch outward in long, uneven ribbons, sometimes thin as mist, sometimes thick enough to cover whole patches of mud like snow laid gently over the earth. Between them, darker seams cut through the plain, channels where seepage rises more strongly, where the chemistry below seems to pulse closer to the surface. This place does not resemble a garden now, it resembles weather, as though the abyss has its own hidden seasons, its own storms of chemistry, its own tides not made by the moon, but by the buried breathing of the planet below. We drift lower, letting the light move slowly across the microbial field. It is beautiful in a difficult way. No bright coral colors, no obvious spectacle, no crowded reef bursting with movement, only pale textures, soft films, quiet patterns spreading in the dark. And yet, the more we look, the more alive it becomes. The mats are not uniform. Some are smooth and waxy looking, others rough and clotted, others feathered at the edges where the sediment grades from chemistry rich to chemistry poor. Each variation suggests a slightly different balance below, a different concentration of methane, a different release of sulfide, a different community of microscopic life at work in silence. These bacterial fields are among the truest foundations of the oasis. They do not merely survive the seep, they interpret it. They spread where the chemistry favors them. They thicken where the hidden flow is rich. They retreat where the seep weakens. They map the invisible with living skin. In this way, the microbes become a language written across the seafloor, a script of the deep, pale sentences traced over mud, slow paragraphs of life marking where the buried earth still speaks. And all around them, larger creatures gather to read what the bacteria have written. Small snails dot the mats like scattered seeds. Crabs cross the pale surfaces with careful claws. Shrimp hover near the edges where patches meet open mud. Tube worms rise in looser groups now, not towering forests, but delicate outposts, their red plumes opening gently into the current as if tasting the water for traces of the unseen source below. Even the shell beds are different here. Instead of dense clustered cities, there are long broken lines of mussels and clams, almost like old roads crossing the field. Perhaps they mark places where seepage once ran stronger. Perhaps the chemistry has shifted over time, leaving behind old, living districts. Quiet, shell-littered traces of where abundance used to bloom more brightly. The toxic oasis is never entirely fixed. That is one of its most haunting qualities. It moves, not by walking, not by tides, but by changing chemistry. A seep that once fed one colony may weaken, a neighbouring patch may grow richer. Bacterial mats spread in one direction and thin in another. Worms flourish where conditions hold. Shell beds remain after life has moved on. The seafloor remembers every version of the oasis, and here in this broad pale field, we seem to be gliding through several of those versions at once. Active patches, fading patches, future patches still only hinted at by the first veil of bacteria over the mud. It is like reading time laid flat across the bottom of the sea. A faint movement stirs near one of the brighter mats. At first, it seems to be only current, a slow wavering in the pale film. Then the light catches the source, a colony of tiny worms extending from the sediment like soft threads. They sway almost imperceptibly in the water, not dramatic enough to command attention, not large enough to anchor the eye, and yet together they give the whole field a living breath. Everywhere, motion remains small, distributed, shared among hundreds of quiet bodies instead of concentrated in one grand display. This is abundance made humble, not loud with colour, not violent with competition, but rich in the way old hidden things are rich, layered, patient, easily overlooked by any gaze that expects spectacle. Perhaps that is why the deep ocean feels so often misunderstood. We look for monsters, for giants, for sudden revelations, and they do exist. But so much of the abyss is ruled instead by modest miracles, by bacteria that can turn poison into sustenance, by worms that farm invisible partners inside themselves, by shell beds that mark old chemistry like fossils of a hidden weather, by fields of pale life spread softly across the seafloor where no sunlight has ever fallen. The field beneath us widens farther still. At its centre, a patch of sediment appears brighter than the rest, almost gleaming white in the beam. The mats there are thick, smooth, and uninterrupted, a broad sheet of microbial life coating the mud with the look of winter frost. Around its edge, larger animals gather. Crabs move in slow circuits, snails cluster in astonishing numbers, a fish hovers at a distance neither fully entering nor leaving the zone, and near one darker seam, a few tube worm plumes open like tiny crimson flames against the pale ground. This is not a random arrangement, it is zoning. Order. A community shaped by gradients too subtle for quick eyes to grasp. Where the chemistry is strongest, one kind of life dominates. Where it softens, another moves in. Where the seep fades into ordinary abyssal mud, the colony thins, and the great emptiness resumes its rule. The oasis is not just alive, it is organized. That is what begins to feel so profound here. This hidden ecosystem is not a temporary chaos fed by leaking chemicals. It is a structured world, a system of borders and preferences and occupations, an architecture built without sunlight, without leaves, without surface time. And in that architecture, the microbial mats are like the first streets, the first foundations, the first delicate floor on which everything else rests. We remain above the field for a long, quiet moment, letting the pale patterns widen beneath us. The scene is so gentle, so restrained, that it would be easy to mistake it for stillness. But the field is alive in every direction, alive in the bacteria spreading across the mud, alive in the shells half buried at old seep margins, alive in the worms extending from sediment like soft thoughts, alive in the crabs and shrimp moving from patch to patch, alive in the chemistry rising from below, slowly, persistently, feeding a world that should not have been possible. And perhaps that is the most beautiful truth the toxic oasis keeps offering us. That life does not always bloom in bright places. Sometimes it blooms in whispers, sometimes it blooms in stains, sometimes it blooms where the earth leaks its cold breath into eternal night, and no one is meant to see. As we move toward the denser gathering at the far edge of the field, the pale microbial mats begin to break apart into islands. Long white ribbons narrow into patches. The silver frost of bacteria no longer covers the mud in broad, smooth language, but clings instead to specific places, to seams, to cracks, to favored ground where the chemistry below still rises with quiet generosity. And in those places, life gathers more tightly. What first looked like heavy stones scattered across the sediment now begins to resolve into colonies. Dark mussel beds packed shoulder to shoulder, clusters of clams buried so deeply that only their shells show through the mud. Low forests of tube worms rising in groups, their pale tubes crowded together, their crimson plumes trembling softly in the current. The field behind us felt like possibility. This place feels like settlement. There is a sense here of arrival, as though the hidden chemical road we have been following across the abyss has led us at last to one of its richer towns. We lower ourselves gently above the colony. The mussels are the first to hold the eye. They lie in thick banks, some stacked over one another, some wedged into small depressions in the sediment, others arranged in long, uneven mounds following the seep line beneath. Their shells are dark, almost blue-black in places, though the light catches pale edges where age, sediment, and chemistry have worn them smooth. They appear passive, still, close to the world, but inside, a remarkable bargain continues. Within their tissues live bacteria that can use methane and sulfide as a source of energy. The mussels are not merely animals resting near the seep, they are homes for chemistry, living vessels carrying invisible factories in their own flesh. That truth changes the way they look. No longer just shellfish on the seafloor, but quiet partnerships, thousands of bodies anchored in darkness, each one containing an alliance older than language. The clams nearby tell a similar story. Some are half buried, only their upper shells visible through the pale mud. Others lie in thicker groups where the sediment seems especially rich. They too depend on internal symbionts, hidden companions turning toxic seep compounds into nourishment. If the microbial mats are the written language of the seep, then these mussel and clam beds are its living monuments. They mark where the chemistry has been generous enough. steady enough for larger, slower lives to root themselves into place. And above them, the tube worms rise. There is something almost ceremonial about them. Their white tubes lift from the sediment in clustered ranks, soft columns in the dark. At their tips, the red plumes extend into the water, delicate, feather-like, almost floral in the beam of our light. They do not sway dramatically, only a slow breathing motion, a subtle opening to the current. They look fragile, but their presence here is an act of endurance. Like so many seep creatures, these worms do not rely on ordinary feeding. They house bacteria within themselves, deep internal companions that convert chemical energy into life. The worm offers protection, transport, access to the seeped compounds. The bacteria provide nourishment. Again and again, the oasis returns to this same deep principle, life within life. One body surviving through the labor of another, partnership as destiny in a place where independence would fail. We drift along the edge of the colony. A crab picks its way across a bed of shells, pausing now and then to test the sediment. Small snails cluster in astonishing numbers between the mussels, their shells glinting faintly. Shrimp hover above the tube worms, then lift and vanish toward a darker seam in the mud. No part of the colony is empty. Even the spaces between the larger forms are inhabited by tiny worms in the sediment, by microbial films on shell surfaces, by minute crustaceans threading through the colony like living punctuation. This is abundance in deep-sea terms, not riotous, not loud, but dense with hidden transactions. Each shell bed is also a history. Some mussels are alive and tightly sealed, others gape slightly, long empty. Broken shells lie beneath the living ones. Whole generations remain underfoot, compressed into layers that will one day become part of the substrate for future colonies. The oasis is always building on its own past. Death does not clear the colony, it deepens it. Shells become structure, ruins become habitat. What once housed one life becomes the ground on which another settles. This layering gives the colony a feeling of age, not just biological age, but civic age, as though this were an old city, built over older foundations still. Perhaps that is why the deep so easily suggests forgotten civilizations to the mind. The tube worms like towers, the shell beds like districts, the bacterial mats like roads or walls or pale public squares. More, the microbial mats would fade. The shell beds would remain as the quiet memory of what had once been fed here. So much of this richness rests on a gift that cannot be seen directly. That makes the colony feel both powerful and vulnerable. Powerful because it proves how much life can be built from so little. From a narrow chemical leak in a place of cold and pressure. Vulnerable because all of it depends on the steady continuation of that invisible gift. Beneath the worms, beneath the mussels, beneath the clams and bacterial films, the buried earth still exhales. Methane rises, sulfides seep upward, minerals alter the mud, microbes feed, larger creatures gather, predators linger at the edge, shells accumulate, and the colony endures. We drift onward across the settlement, past denser shell banks and taller clusters of tubes, past pockets where life seems to press close together in quiet concentration. It is impossible not to feel that we have crossed from wilderness into society, not human society, not anything ruled by speech or law, but a deep-sea society all the same, structured by energy, held together by cooperation, defined by gradients of chemistry instead of roads or walls, and just beyond the richest part of the colony, another change begins. The mussel banks thin, the worm clusters break apart, the sediment grows darker once more, a long shadowed margin stretches ahead, one that feels less settled, more exposed. The oasis is leading us outward again, toward its borderlands, where abundance becomes uncertainty, and where the creatures of the colony meet the vast hunger of the open abyss. Beyond the crowded shell banks, the colony begins to loosen its grip on the seafloor. The mussels no longer lie pressed together in dark layered mounds. The tube worms no longer rise in close pale ranks. The clams become scattered, half-buried signs of richness thinning into distance. Ahead, the sediment opens again. It is darker here, less silver with bacterial frost, less marked by obvious abundance. The seep is still present, but it feels weaker now, more uncertain, as though the buried chemistry below has begun to whisper instead of speak. This is the borderland of the oasis, not fully empty, not fully thriving, a place between gift and starvation. We drift slowly above it, and immediately the mood changes. The crowded settlement behind us felt held together, organized, anchored by invisible wealth, but the margin feels exposed. Every living thing here seems to stand closer to risk. A lone tube worm cluster rises from the mud like a forgotten outpost. Its tubes are fewer, its red plumes smaller, as though this patch receives only the last faint traces of what richer colonies closer to the seep line enjoy in plenty. Nearby, an old shell bed lies half buried. Most of its inhabitants are gone. Broken valves overlap in pale, brittle layers. A few living clams remain tucked among them. But the place has the feeling of something fading. The borderlands keep such memories. They remember where the oasis used to be stronger. They hold the shells of older abundance. They preserve the outlines of former districts long after the chemistry has shifted elsewhere. In that way, the edge of the seep is full of ghosts. Not supernatural ghosts, not spirits, but ecological ghosts, traces of where life once gathered in greater numbers, ruins left not by war or disaster, but by the slow rearrangement of invisible gradients below the mud. We pass over a patch where the sediment is mottled with pale streaks. The bacterial mats here are thin and broken, like the last snow of a season almost over. A few snails still move across them. A small crab pauses there, touching the ground with deliberate care, as though reading how much food remains in this fading place. Even in decline, the oasis is not abandoned all at once. It recedes gradually, softly, one patch at a time. That slowness gives the whole borderland a sadness that is difficult to name. Nothing is dramatic. Nothing collapses in front of us, and yet everywhere there is the feeling of retreat, of life negotiating with diminishing fortune. Perhaps that is why the open abyss beyond feels so immense here. In richer colonies, the darkness was broken by towers of worms, by dense beds of shells, by fields of pale bacteria declaring where the buried earth still gives. But at the edge, the emptiness returns. It waits only a short distance away, a few meters beyond the last seep-marked patches. The mud smooths out into a darker plain. Almost no structures rise from it. Almost no visible communities interrupt its calm. It stretches outward in all directions with the old, indifferent face of the deep sea. That contrast is the true measure of the oasis, not just what blooms within it, but what surrounds it. A hidden civilization is only meaningful because the wilderness around it is so vast. A rich seep colony feels miraculous because the abyss beyond remains so hungry. A fish moves along the margin now. Not the patient predator we saw earlier, but a smaller one, thin-bodied, alert, keeping just close enough to the last shell beds to search for movement. It is a border creature, neither fully of the colony nor fully of the plain. That seems fitting. Edges are full of such lives, scavengers that benefit from what drifts outward, hunters that patrol where shelter ends, wanderers that venture in when the seep still offers enough, and slip back into emptier country when it does not. The borderland is not merely a place of loss, it is also a place of meeting. The logic of the oasis and the logic of the abyss touch each other here. Abundance meets scarcity, settlement meets wilderness, cooperation meets exposure. The hidden richness of chemistry meets the long, cold poverty of open mud. And in that meeting, new forms of patience appear. A brittle star lies against the sediment, its arms spread wide like a pale star fallen onto the ocean floor. It waits where faint currents may bring drifting particles. A shrimp hovers briefly over an old shell mound, then disappears. Small worms thread through the mud beneath us, where our eyes can barely follow. Invisible microbes continue their work below the surface, even where the seep weakens. Nothing truly ends at a sharp line. It fades, blurs, transforms. That may be one of the deepest truths of the sea. We often imagine boundaries as clear things, a shore, a cliff, a river mouth, a line on a map. But the deep ocean prefers gradients. The seep becomes borderland. The borderland becomes abyss. Richness becomes memory. And memory becomes structure on which some later colony may one day settle again. As we move farther from the thickest part of the oasis, the water above feels larger somehow. The black ceiling higher, the silence broader. It is not that the sound has changed. There was almost none before. It is that life has changed, and with it, the emotional shape of the place. The settlement behind us felt intimate. The ruined mineral zones felt ancient. The broad microbial fields felt dreamlike. But this edge feels lonely, not empty, not dead, only lonelier. A place where the promise of the oasis still lingers, but no longer fully holds. And perhaps every hidden world has such margins, places where the center's strength fades, places where those who remain must rely on less, places where ruins outnumber beginnings. Yet even here, the deep does not surrender entirely. A faint new patch of bacteria glimmers ahead, small and pale against the dark. Not enough to call a field, not enough to support a city of shells, but enough to suggest possibility. That is the patience of the toxic oasis. Even at its edges, even in its fading districts, it keeps trying. A little seep, a little chemistry, a little life gathering around the smallest gift. And as we follow that pale sign onward, the abyss around us, deep and waiting, we begin to understand that the oasis is not one place at all. It is a scattered archipelago of chances, a chain of hidden opportunities across the ocean floor, some strong, some fading, some only just beginning to bloom. Ahead, the new pale patch widens. Beyond it, the seafloor dips toward a darker basin, one that seems quieter, colder, and perhaps older than the colonies we have crossed so far. The oasis is drawing us onward again, away from crowded life, and toward a deeper silence where another secret waits beneath the mud. The seafloor slopes gently downward, And with that slow descent, the whole mood of the oasis begins to change again. The fading shell beds behind us disappear into blackness. The lonely worm clusters become only pale memories in the distance. Ahead, the mud darkens. Smoother now, quieter, as though we are entering a deeper chamber beneath the hidden world we have already seen. Here, the seep is harder to read. There are no broad white fields of bacteria, no crowded banks of mussels, no clustered towers of red-plumed worms rising like underwater gardens. Instead, there are signs. A pale stain on the sediment, a narrow crack running through the mud, a faint shimmer above the ground where fluid touches seawater. A few scattered shells lying where no shell should be if the plain were truly empty. This place feels secret even by deep-sea standards, not because nothing is here, but because everything is quieter, smaller, more hidden. We lower ourselves toward one of the pale stains. At first it looks like nothing more than a thin wash of white over dark mud. But as the light steadies, the surface resolves into a fine microbial film, delicate as frost on glass. The bacteria are here, not in grand abundance, not proclaiming a rich colony, but holding on. That matters. Because even the smallest patch of microbial life means the buried earth is still speaking below. Somewhere under this quiet basin, methane and sulfides continue their slow upward drift. A narrow current of chemistry still reaches the surface of the sediment, and where that current survives, life listens. A few tiny snails move across the film, almost too small to notice. A soft-bodied worm extends part way from the mud, then retreats again. Near the crack, a fragile shrimp hovers for a moment, transparent in the beam, then lifts away into darkness. It is not a city, not even a village. It is more like the first spark of a settlement, a beginning, or perhaps the last remnant of one, and for a while it is impossible to tell which. That uncertainty gives the basin a haunting beauty. In the richer parts of the oasis, life felt established, confident in its strange way. Here, everything feels conditional, as though one small shift below the mud, one weakening of seepage, and the whole place could go dark again. Yet perhaps that is exactly why it feels precious. The deep ocean is full of overwhelming scales, miles of water, immense pressure, vast plains of sediment stretching beyond sight, but sometimes the most moving thing in such a world is not immensity. It is persistence, a small patch of bacteria in a dark basin, a few shells marking old abundance, a shrimp hovering above a chemical whisper, life holding its place where almost nothing has been offered. We drift along the crack in the sediment. It twists across the basin floor like a thin black vein. In a few places, pale mineral crust has formed at its edges. In others, the mud looks softer, slightly disturbed, as though something below has breathed against it not long ago. The basin does not feel dead. It feels listening. Perhaps that is the true nature of the toxic oasis, not one single kingdom, but a scattered conversation between sea and earth. Some places answer loudly with shell beds and worm forests. Others answer in murmurs, with little more than a film of bacteria over cracked mud. Both belong to the same hidden world. Both prove the same impossible thing, that even here, in cold darkness, far below sunlight and weather and memory, the planet can still create a place for life. We pause above the pale film one last time. The tiny snails continue their patient movement. The mud remains still. The black water above us says nothing, and yet the message is clear. The oasis does not need grandeur to be real. Sometimes all it needs is a whisper, a thin seep, a little chemistry, a little life refusing to leave. And as we move onward into the deeper basin, following the faintest traces of that buried breath, it feels as though the ocean is leading us not toward spectacle, but toward understanding. That its darkest worlds are not empty, only quiet. We continue deeper into the basin, following not a road, not a ridge, but a feeling. The pale signs of seepage are faint here, so faint that they seem to come and go with the angle of the light. One moment, the mud appears empty, smooth, unbroken, and the next, a thin silver film glimmers across it like breath upon cold glass. The deeper we move into this quieter region, the more the toxic oasis begins to resemble a secret still being written. Not every chapter of the deep is loud with worms and shells. Some are softer than that, some are made only of hints, of beginnings too small for the world above to ever notice. A narrow depression opens ahead of us, a shallow fold in the seafloor where darker sediment has gathered. Its edges are lined with broken shell fragments. Not many, just enough to suggest that life has paused here before. Perhaps this place was richer once. Perhaps the seep line shifted. Perhaps another colony will bloom here in some century still to come. The basin keeps its answers to itself. We drift down over the fold, and the lights reveal a fragile dusting of white spread unevenly across the mud. Bacterial growth again, thin, patchy, but unmistakable. In the richest seeps, the microbes seemed like broad fields. Here they feel more like handwriting, small pale strokes across a dark page, a few sentences from the buried earth, written in chemistry, read by whatever life is patient enough to remain. A soft-bodied worm extends from the sediment nearby. Its body is almost translucent, so delicate that it seems formed from the water itself. It reaches outward for a moment, then slowly withdraws, as if the basin has taught even curiosity to be careful. Nearby, a tiny crustacean moves over the pale film. Its motion is quick, but not frantic. It stops, feeds, moves again. That is the rhythm of this place. No rush. No spectacle, only the small, faithful acts of survival repeating in silence. Above us, the black water remains immense. It presses downward with the old weight of the sea, cold, heavy, indifferent. And yet even here, even under that endless burden, the basin holds a kind of tenderness, not warmth, not safety, but tenderness in the sense that life has chosen not to abandon it. That feels important. We often imagine that hidden worlds must be dramatic to matter, that if something survives in darkness, it must do so grandly, with monsters, with strange lights, with scenes that justify the miles of black water above. But the deep does not always offer grandeur. Sometimes it offers restraint. Sometimes it offers a few living threads stretched carefully across emptiness, and asks us to see wonder there too. A little farther on, the sediment changes again. The pale microbial dusting gathers more thickly near a low ridge of mineral crust. The ridge is not tall, only a raised line in the mud, but its surface is rougher than the basin around it, mottled with old deposits. Along its sheltered side, life has collected. Small snails cluster there in greater numbers. A few shrimp hover just above the bottom, and in one narrow pocket, several thin worm tubes rise from the sediment like fragile straws. It is not a forest. It is not even a grove, but it is enough to show what the oasis always does when chemistry lingers. It gathers life together. A small settlement, a minor refuge, a pause in the loneliness of the basin. We pass slowly over the ridge and watch as the creatures hold their quiet positions. The snails cling, the shrimp lift and turn in place. The tubes remain still, their living inhabitants hidden below. Nothing here wastes itself on unnecessary movement. Perhaps that is why the deep feels so wise at times, not because it speaks, but because it removes all excess. Down here, every living thing seems to understand a truth the surface often forgets, that survival can be soft, that endurance does not always roar, that sometimes life continues simply by remaining where the smallest gift still exists. The ridge fades behind us. Ahead, the basin floor opens once more, but now there is a new texture to the darkness, a sense of layering, a subtle unevenness in the mud as though buried currents of chemistry have shaped the ground from below. We are moving into an older part of the oasis now, a place where the signs of life are not only living signs, but preserved ones. Shell fragments, mineral seams, faded bacterial stains, traces left by earlier abundance. The basin is beginning to feel like memory. Not memory in the human sense. No mind is holding these moments. No story is being told below the mud. And yet the seafloor remembers. It remembers where seepage once rose strongly. It remembers where clams gathered, where bacteria spread, where a little colony endured for a while in the cold dark. That memory remains written in structure, in stains, in broken shell, in the changed texture of the basin floor. The toxic oasis is not just alive in the present, it is layered with former lives. And as we move quietly through this dim remembering place, it becomes clear that the deep ocean keeps almost everything. Not in perfect form, not unchanged, but enough. Enough for the next colony to settle on. Enough for the next seep to gather around. Enough for the darkness to never be truly empty. Far ahead, something pale begins to rise from the mud. Not large, not sudden, but distinct enough to catch the eye. Another cluster, another answer. Even here. The basin is not finished speaking. The pale shape ahead rises slowly out of the basin floor, so softly that for a moment it feels more imagined than real. We drift closer. It is not a shell bed, not a field of bacteria, not one of the crowded settlements we crossed before. It is a small cluster of worm tubes, thin, pale, and widely spaced, standing from the mud like the last fragile remains of a forgotten garden. No grand forest surrounds them, no dark banks of mussels press at their base, only a faint whitening of the sediment nearby. A subtle sign that the seep still breathes here, though weakly, and yet the tubes remain. That alone gives the place a kind of dignity. A few red plumes extend from the tops, small and delicate in the light, opening into the water with the same quiet trust we have seen again and again in the oasis. Inside each worm, the old partnership continues, bacteria turning buried chemistry into nourishment, life inside life. A hidden agreement holding steady in the cold. The cluster is modest, but it changes the feeling of the basin. Until now, this deeper region has felt like aftermath, a place of fading signs and soft remnants. But these worms are not only memory, they are presence. They prove the chemistry still reaches upward here, not strongly enough to build a city of shells, but enough to keep a few living towers anchored in the dark. We move slowly around them. A tiny shrimp hovers near one tube, then glides away. A snail clings to the sediment below. The pale film of bacteria spreads in broken strokes around the cluster, like a half-finished map. Everything here feels reduced to essentials. No extra motion, no wasted color, no abundance beyond what the seep can truly support. Perhaps this is the quiet heart of the deep sea. Not richness, not emptiness, but balance. A balance so narrow that every life must fit itself carefully into what is given. The tubes cast thin shadows across the mud. Beyond them, the basin remains wide and dark. But near their base, the ground is changed, more textured, more alive. That is what the oasis always does. Where chemistry reaches the surface, the seafloor becomes different, not only in the creatures that gather there, but in the very feeling of the place. Ordinary abyssal mud feels silent in one way. These seep-marked sediments feel silent in another, a charged silence, a waiting silence, as though the earth below is still whispering through every grain. We leave the small worm cluster behind, and as it fades into darkness, it seems less like a colony, and more like a signal fire, a small red-lit promise in the black, a reminder that even the weakest seep can summon life. Ahead, the basin floor dips once more, the pale stains grow sparser, the shell fragments disappear, the mud smooths into long cold emptiness. For a while, it seems we may finally be leaving the oasis, but then far off in the distance the light catches something else. Not white this time, a faint, darker rise, low, broad, still. Something older waits there, half buried in the basin's quiet floor, and the deeper we move toward it, the more it begins to feel less like living colony, and more like the preserved remains of a world the seep once fed. The darker rise ahead does not move. It waits in the basin floor, low and broad, like a buried memory slowly pushing back through the mud. As we draw closer, the shape begins to separate into details: broken shells, mineral crust, collapsed tube fragments, all of it half covered by sediment, all of it softened by time. This is not an active colony, it is an old one, a place where the seep once fed life more generously, where worms once stood taller, where shell beds once pressed tightly together, where bacterial films likely spread brighter across the mud. Now, only the remains endure. There is something deeply moving about that. Not because it is tragic in a dramatic way. Nothing here collapsed suddenly. Nothing was shattered by storm or flame. The colony simply faded as the chemistry beneath it changed, and the life above slowly thinned. That is the deep sea's way, not endings shouted into the dark, but endings whispered over centuries. We drift above the old mound in silence. The shells are brittle now, many broken open, their edges dulled by sediment and time. Some still lie in dense layers, pressed over one another like the roof tiles of a buried town. Between them, thin mineral seams run through the mud, the last hard traces of seepage preserved in stone. A few small snails move over the mound. A pale worm threads briefly from the sediment and disappears. Even here, where the colony has largely passed, life has not left completely. It never leaves completely. That may be one of the most haunting truths of the oasis. Its strongest places bloom, its weaker places fade. But the deep continues to reuse almost everything. Old shell beds become shelter, dead tubes become structure, mineral crust becomes foundation. The past does not vanish here, it settles, and later, something living returns to rest upon it. The mound beneath us feels like memory made physical, a record written not in words, but in layers, One layer of shells, one layer of mud, one layer of mineral deposit, another layer of shells again. Each one marks a period of hidden abundance, a season in the life of the seep, a quiet chapter now closed but not erased. We move slowly along its edge. On one side, the mound rises in a rough line. On the other, it slopes gently back into smooth, dark sediment. That contrast feels almost symbolic. One side remembers, the other side forgets. And between them, the deep keeps drifting onward. Far above, the surface world still burns with daylight somewhere. Waves still break, ships still pass. Human hours continue their quick, bright movement. But down here, time feels heavier, more patient. A whole colony can live and fade, while the darkness barely changes its expression. Perhaps that is why this old seep mound feels less like ruin, and more like endurance. Its first life is gone, yet its shape remains. Its chemistry remains in traces. Its structures remain ready for whatever small creatures may still find use in them. Even in silence, it continues to give. We pause over the highest part of the mound. Nothing dramatic happens. No creature bursts from the mud. No hidden predator appears from the dark. Only stillness. A profound, layered stillness. And in that stillness, the truth becomes clear. The toxic oasis is not only a place of living wonder, it is also a place of inheritance. Each generation leaves something for the next, even in death, even in fading, even after the seep grows weak. Ahead, beyond the old mound, the basin darkens again, the remains fall away behind us, and somewhere, farther on, the faintest, pale shimmer begins to gather once more. Not memory this time, something living, something beginning again. Beyond the old mound, the basin opens once more into dark, level mud. For a little while it feels empty. No worm tubes rise ahead. No shell banks break the smooth floor. No broad bacterial field spreads its pale language across the sediment. Only distance, only cold, only the quiet pressure of deep water, resting over everything like a second sky made of black stone. And then, very slowly, the shimmer returns. At first, it is so faint that it seems like a trick of the light, a whitening on the mud, a slight brightening in one narrow band of sediment. But as we drift closer, the pattern becomes unmistakable, a new seep line, not large, not rich enough yet to feel like a settlement, but alive in the way beginnings are alive. The pale film of bacteria runs along the seafloor in a broken curve, like the first chalk mark of a road still being drawn. It is thin in some places, thicker in others, as though the chemistry below has only recently begun to gather strength here. This is what makes the oasis feel almost eternal, not because any one colony lasts forever, but because while one place fades, another begins. The old mound behind us was memory. This pale seam ahead is possibility. We lower toward it. The microbial film has a soft, waxy look under the beam, like frost settling over dark soil at the edge of winter. Tiny snails already move across it. A few almost invisible worms disturb the sediment just beneath. Near one thicker patch, a pair of shrimp hover close to the ground, careful, precise, as if testing what this new seep has to offer. Life arrives early. That is one of the great lessons of the deep. The moment a gift appears, however small, something comes to meet it. The seep does not need to become a grand field before it matters. Even now, in this first modest expression, it is changing the basin around it. The mud is no longer only mud. It has become a threshold, a place where buried chemistry touches open water, and where the first layers of a future community may already be taking shape. We follow the line as it bends gently through the sediment. Here and there, tiny shell fragments lie scattered nearby, perhaps carried from older colonies, perhaps the first small signs of creatures that settled and passed on before the seep fully strengthened. Either way, they make the place feel connected, as though every part of the oasis is linked by a long hidden migration of life and chemistry across the seafloor. Nothing is isolated here. The active colonies, the fading edges, the old ruins, the new beginnings, all belong to the same quiet cycle. A little farther along the seep line, the bacteria gather more thickly around a shallow crack. The mud there is slightly raised, slightly rougher, and for one brief moment a tiny bubble escapes upward, catches the light, and disappears into the black water above. A single breath from below. That small release changes everything. It confirms what the pale film had already promised. The Earth is still feeding this place. Somewhere beneath the basin floor, methane and sulfides are moving upward through old buried layers. Not enough yet for towers of worms, not enough yet for banks of mussels, but enough. Enough for bacteria to spread, enough for grazers to gather, enough for the first architecture of life to begin again. Perhaps this is how the deep ocean survives its own silence, not through permanence, but through renewal so patient that it almost escapes notice. We hover above the shallow crack and the new white seam trailing away from it. The shrimp remain near the thicker patch, the snails continue their slow wandering. The bubble is gone, the mud is still, and yet this place feels more hopeful than anything we have seen in some time. Not bright hope, not loud hope, deep sea hope. A thin chemical whisper in darkness, a line of bacteria over cold mud. A few small creatures arriving before the world even realizes something has begun. Behind us lies the ruin of an older colony. Ahead of us lies the uncertain future of this one. And between those 2 points, the toxic oasis reveals its truest nature. It is not a single hidden garden, it is a chain of beginnings and endings, scattered through the abyss, each one fed by the secret breath of the earth. We move onward along the new seep line, following its pale curve deeper into the basin, while the darkness around it remains vast and unchanged. But now the silence feels different, not empty, expectant. We follow the pale seam deeper into the basin, and the longer we remain above it, the more it begins to feel like a quiet promise, not a promise of spectacle, not of giant creatures or sudden wonders, but of slow becoming. The bacterial film widens in places now, spreading beyond the narrow crack that first fed it. The mud carries a soft whitening over a broader stretch of seafloor, as though the oasis is gently testing how far it can reach. Tiny life gathers wherever it does. More snails appear. A few delicate worms leave faint marks in the sediment. Small shrimp hover near the thicker patches, rising and settling again with careful precision. It is still a young place, still fragile. And because of that, every sign of life feels magnified. A future colony often begins like this, not with towers or shell banks, but with a thin microbial claim upon the dark. We drift slowly over one wider patch, where the film looks smoother, denser, more certain of itself. Here the sediment beneath seems slightly disturbed, as if the hidden chemistry below is pressing closer to the surface. The seep is strengthening, not enough to transform the basin all at once, but enough for the first quiet stages of abundance to take hold. This is the beauty of the toxic oasis in its earliest form. It does not announce itself, it arrives almost shyly. A whisper beneath the mud, a stain across the dark, a few small creatures answering before the rest of the world even knows a table has been set. We pass a shallow depression where pale bacteria gather more thickly along the edges. Inside it, the mud is darker, richer somehow, and scattered shell fragments lie half buried like the first stones of a foundation. Perhaps they drifted here from older seep grounds. Perhaps they are the remains of creatures that tested this place before it was ready. Either way, they make the basin feel connected to its own history. Nothing in the oasis begins from nothing. Every new place is touched by what came before: a shell, a mineral ridge, a faint chemical pathway through buried sediment. The deep keeps using its old stories to start new ones. Ahead, a few thin worm tubes come into view, only 3 at first, then 5, then a small scattered cluster. They are shorter than the older worm colonies we crossed earlier, more delicate, less certain in their hold. Their red plumes are small, opening carefully into the current, but they are here. And that matters more than their size, because the arrival of worms changes the meaning of the seep. The place is no longer only a microbial beginning, it is becoming a community. The worms stand like the first upright signs of commitment in the dark, proof that the chemistry below has become steady enough, trustworthy enough, for larger lives to root themselves into it. We circle gently above them. A shrimp passes between 2 tubes. A snail clings to the pale sediment below. The bacteria spread in broken patches around their bases, feeding the whole scene with invisible energy. Everything remains small. Everything remains quiet. And yet the basin no longer feels lonely. That is how the oasis grows, not through conquest, not through speed, but by slowly changing the emotional shape of the seafloor. A little more life here, a little more structure there, a little less emptiness with every hidden breath from below. Far around us, the black water still stretches without end. The open abyss still waits beyond the seep line. But here, in this one modest place, the darkness has already begun to lose its hold. Life is gathering. Softly, patiently, inevitably. And as we drift onward past the first young worm cluster, following the pale trail deeper through the basin, and it becomes clear that we are watching not just survival, but the making of another hidden world. The young worm cluster fades slowly behind us, its pale tubes and small red plumes dissolving back into the basin's gentle dark. Ahead, the seep line bends again. It does not move like a river. It does not cut sharply through the mud. It only suggests itself. Through pale bacterial growth, through changed sediment, through the quiet way small creatures begin appearing where emptiness had been. We follow that suggestion. The basin floor here feels softer, more open, yet also more prepared, as though the chemistry below has spent a long time shaping this place before allowing life to gather on it. The microbial film widens into broken patches. Between them, the mud remains dark and smooth. The contrast is beautiful in its own restrained way, white against black, life against waiting, a hidden map written in the cold. A few more worm tubes rise ahead, though not in dense groups. They are scattered, each one standing at a slight distance from the others, like early settlers, unsure where the strongest gift will remain. Their plumes are open, their bodies still. Inside them, the same invisible partnership continues. Bacteria turning seeped chemicals into nourishment, worms offering shelter and form. Again and again, the oasis returns to this truth. Nothing here survives entirely alone. Even in its youngest colonies, even in its weakest beginnings, life must braid itself with other life, with microbes, with chemistry, with the buried breath of the earth. Near one tube, the sediment has gathered into a low mound. Shell fragments lie around it in a loose, pale ring. Not enough to call a bed, not enough to call a ruin, only a sign that layering has already begun. This is how a deep-sea settlement starts. First, the bacteria, then the grazers, then the worms, then the shells that remain after life passes through. Then, if the seep endures, more structure, more clustering, more hidden complexity. The whole process feels less like growth in the ordinary sense and more like listening, as if the creatures below are always waiting to hear whether the earth still has enough to give. A shrimp hovers over one thicker patch of bacteria, then turns suddenly and vanishes into the dark margin beyond the seep. A snail crosses the pale film with impossible patience. Beneath the mud, unseen worms and microbes continue their older work. Nothing is wasted here. No gift goes unanswered. The seep line ahead narrows for a while, then broadens again around a shallow basin within the basin, a gentle hollow in the mud where white microbial film gathers more strongly. Its edges are soft, its center darker. The whole thing looks like a breath pressed into the seafloor. We lower over it carefully. This little hollow feels important, not because it is large, but because it gathers several signs at once. Bacteria thick enough to whiten the sediment, a few worm tubes at the edge, tiny shell remains scattered nearby, and near the center, a faint shimmering in the water just above the mud. The seep is active here, still subtle, still quiet, but active enough to make the place feel alive with hidden intention. For a moment, the whole hollow seems suspended between two futures. If the chemistry strengthens, this could become another field, another colony, another little city of shells and tubes in the dark. If it weakens, it may remain only this, a brief, living gesture in the basin, beautiful and temporary. The deep does not promise permanence, it only offers chances. And perhaps that is why these places feel so tender, because every colony, every seep line, every pale patch of bacteria is an agreement renewed moment by moment between the earth below and the life above. We hover there in silence. The worm plumes barely move. The bacterial film shines softly under the beam. The black water above remains endless and calm. Then, slowly, we continue onward, following the seep as it leads us farther through the basin, toward whatever larger form this new hidden world may yet become. We move beyond a shallow hollow, and the basin begins to feel less uncertain. The seep line is still delicate, still pale and quiet against the dark mud, but now it holds a steadier shape. The bacterial film no longer appears only in brief fragments. It stretches farther, thickens in places, returns again after every darker gap. The hidden world is gathering confidence. That change is subtle, but unmistakable. A few worm tubes become a few more. A few shell fragments become loose little clusters. A few wandering snails become a regular presence along the pale ground. Nothing here has grown loud. Nothing has become crowded. And yet the basin no longer feels like a place wondering whether life will stay. It feels like a place beginning to believe that it can. We follow the widening seam slowly, our light gliding over white bacterial film that spreads like soft frost along the mud. In one patch it gathers around a narrow crack. In another, it blooms gently across a low ridge. Each change in texture tells the same quiet story. The earth below is still giving. Near one thicker patch, several worm tubes stand closer together than any we have seen since entering this deeper basin. They are not tall, not numerous enough to resemble the great colonies we crossed earlier, but together they create a sense of structure, a beginning of architecture. Their red plumes open softly into the current. At their base, the sediment is pale and slightly raised. A few snails move between them, and one small shrimp hovers just beyond the cluster, keeping close to the enriched ground. This is how the oasis returns, not all at once, not as spectacle, but as patient accumulation. One seep line strengthening, one cluster holding, one little district forming where before there had only been scattered signs. The shell fragments nearby catch the light. Some are old and worn thin. Some seem newer, cleaner, less buried by time. Already the place is layering itself. Already the future is building on remains. The deep waste's almost nothing. That truth lingers with us as we drift onward. Above, the water remains vast and silent. Beyond the seep, the open abyss still waits in every direction. The darkness has lost none of its size, and yet here, on the basin floor, the silence has changed again. It no longer feels lonely. It feels occupied by bacteria turning poison into life, by worms trusting their hidden symbionts, by shrimp, snails, and small unseen grazers answering every faint enrichment in the mud. Life is not merely surviving here now, it is arranging itself. Ahead, the pale seam bends around another low rise in the sediment. The microbial film brightens there. And for the first time in a long while, the basin begins to suggest not just a new colony, but the early shape of a new field. We continue toward it, slowly, as though entering the next chapter of the oasis while it is still being written. We approach the low rise with quiet care, and as our light settles over it, the basin reveals a gentler richness than before. The pale bacterial film spreads wider here, not in a great sweeping field, not yet, but in broad enough patches that the mud begins to lose its emptiness, white against dark, life against waiting, the old hidden contrast of the oasis becoming visible once more. The rise itself is slight, just enough to gather the seep's chemistry along its edges. There, the sediment looks brighter, softer in some places, rougher in others, as though the earth below has been pressing upward for a very long time, in patient secret. A few more worm tubes stand along the brighter side. Their plumes are open, small, and calm, like red thoughts held gently in the water. Nearby, shell fragments have become shell clusters, still loose, still far from the dense banks of older colonies, but enough to suggest that creatures have begun returning here more often, settling, feeding, and leaving behind the first hard traces of continuity. That is what changes everything. A seep becomes a place when life begins to return to it repeatedly, when the mud no longer receives only a passing visitor, but starts to hold memory in shell, tube, and mineral seam. We drift lower over one pale patch, where snails move slowly across the bacterial film. A shrimp hovers nearby, almost transparent in the light, then slips sideways and settles again. These are small motions, barely enough to disturb the silence, but together they make the rise feel inhabited. The basin is no longer merely listening, it is answering. The deeper truth of the toxic oasis begins to show itself again here, that life in the abyss does not conquer the darkness. It persuades it. A little chemistry, a little partnership, a little repeated survival, and slowly the black plain becomes a living place. We follow the pale spread farther across the rise. In one shallow groove, the bacterial film thickens into a smoother white band. At its edge, several worm tubes stand closer together than before, and scattered shells lie around them, like the first rough paving of a future settlement. Nothing dramatic announces this growth. No grand threshold has been crossed, but the feeling is unmistakable. This seep is becoming reliable, not rich yet, not crowded yet, but trustworthy enough that life has begun to invest itself here. That may be one of the most beautiful ideas in the whole deep sea. That even in darkness, even under crushing pressure, living things can recognize a place worth staying for. Above us, the black water remains endless. Behind us lie old ruins, fading margins, and younger clusters. Ahead, this rise may become something more. And as we glide slowly across its whitening surface, following the soft spread of bacteria and the first careful architecture of returning life, the oasis feels once again like a world being made in secret. We leave the brightest part of the rise behind us, but the feeling of it stays, not because it was large, not because it was crowded, but because it carried that rare deep-sea certainty, the sense that life had found a place it could trust. Ahead, the basin floor stretches outward once more in long, dark curves, yet now the darkness feels altered. Not weaker, not smaller, only less absolute. Once you have seen bacteria whitening the mud, once you have seen worm tubes rise from what should have been emptiness, the abyss can no longer pretend to be entirely barren. It has been answered. The seep continues in fragments before us, a pale patch here, a thin line there, a slight roughening of sediment where hidden chemistry brushes close to the surface. No single sign is dramatic, but together they form a path, a quiet thread drawing us onward. We follow it slowly. On one side, the basin remains smooth and dark, almost untouched. On the other, the mud carries small interruptions, shell pieces, mineral seams, tiny bacterial smudges across the ground. It is like walking beside the first unfinished wall of a buried city. A few scattered worm tubes appear again, then vanish into the dimness, then return in another loose cluster farther on. The pattern suggests a seep that strengthens and weakens in pulses, feeding one patch more generously than the next. That, too, is the language of the oasis. It does not always bloom evenly. It gathers in pockets. It pauses. It resumes. It leaves one place thinly touched, and another quietly transformed. We drift above a darker patch of mud where the light catches something half buried. At first it seems to be only stone, then shell, then several shells together. Old ones, partly covered by sediment, their edges worn soft with time. Not enough to mark a major colony, only enough to say life has tested this place before. Perhaps the seep was stronger here once. Perhaps it will be again. That uncertainty gives the deep its strange sadness and its strange peace. Nothing here is fixed forever, but nothing is ever truly lost either. The basin remembers in fragments, and those fragments become invitations. A shrimp lifts suddenly from the mud, and drifts through our beam like a pale thought. It pauses over a thin bacterial streak, then settles again. Nearby, one small snail moves with patient certainty across the sediment, following nourishment too subtle for us to see. These creatures do not need spectacle. They need enough chemistry, enough stability, enough of the Earth's hidden breath to remain. Perhaps that is why the oasis feels so different from the world above. The surface often chases abundance. The deep more often honors sufficiency. Ahead, the pale signs begin to gather again near a low mineral seam. The mud there is slightly uplifted, slightly whitened, slightly changed. The familiar pattern returns. Bacteria first, small grazers next. The earliest hints of another cluster preparing to form. And as we move toward that soft brightening in the dark, it becomes clear that the toxic oasis is never only one garden, or one ruin, or one settlement. It is a chain of answers. One answer fading, another beginning, another waiting below the mud for its time to rise. We continue onward, through black water and quiet pressure, following the patient logic of life wherever the buried earth still chooses to speak. We move toward the low mineral seam, and the farther we go, the more the basin begins to gather itself again. The pale whitening of the mud is still subtle, still modest compared with the older colonies we crossed before, but it is no longer uncertain. The seep is present here, steady enough to leave its mark, steady enough to invite life into another small arrangement. The seam runs like a quiet scar across the seafloor. Along its edge, bacteria have spread in a thin, bright band, a soft line of living chemistry laid over the dark mud. In places it thickens, in places it breaks apart, but it continues far enough to feel intentional, as if the earth below has traced a path for the oasis to follow. We drift lower. Small snails gather along the brightest patches, moving with slow devotion over the film. A shrimp hovers nearby, turning carefully in the water before settling again. And just beyond the thickest part of the seam, a few worm tubes rise, not many, only enough to shift the feeling of the place. Their pale bodies stand from the sediment with the same calm confidence we have seen in every true seep ground. Their red plumes are open. Their stillness feels complete. That stillness is never emptiness. Inside each tube, life is busy in its hidden way. Bacteria continue their patient work. The worm continues its trust. And together they prove once more that the deep sea does not require light to build meaning. A few shells lie scattered near the tubes, newer than the old half-buried fragments behind us, cleaner, less worn by time. They suggest that this seam has been feeding life long enough now for the first small layers of history to begin forming. The basin is learning to remember this place. That idea settles over us as we circle slowly above the seam. The bacterial band, the worm tubes, the scattered shells, the tiny grazers at work across the pale ground. None of it is grand, and yet all of it matters, because this is how hidden worlds are built. Not in one sudden creation, but in repeated acts of enough. Enough chemistry to whiten the mud, enough stability for worms to anchor, enough nourishment for shells to remain, enough time for one small patch of darkness to become different from all of the darkness around it. The open basin still stretches beyond in every direction, cold, wide, patient. But here along the seam, the abyss has been interrupted, a place has formed, and as we move onward beside that pale living line, Following it deeper into the basin's quiet heart, it becomes clear that the toxic oasis is not fading behind us. It is beginning again, over and over, wherever the buried earth still offers even the smallest chance for life to gather. We follow the living seam as it stretches onward through the basin, and with every quiet meter, the place feels a little less like a trace, and a little more like a decision. The bacterial band remains thin, but it holds together now with greater confidence. It no longer appears only in broken fragments scattered by chance. It runs across the mud in a pale, deliberate line, as though the seep below has found a steadier voice. On one side of the seam, the abyss remains smooth and dark, open mud, little movement, a silence so complete it feels almost untouched. On the other side, life has begun to gather into a pattern. Tiny snails move over the film in patient arcs. A shrimp hovers above the brightest patch, rising slightly, then settling again. Near a shallow crack in the sediment, several worm tubes stand close enough together to suggest the beginning of a true colony. Not large, not crowded, but no longer solitary. That difference matters. A single worm tube feels like survival. A small group feels like trust. We lower toward them, their pale bodies rise from the mud with quiet steadiness. At the top of each tube, the red plumes open gently into the water, not dramatic, not bright enough to break the mood of the basin. Only soft reminders that even here in chemical darkness, life can still resemble something like a flower. At their base, the sediment is more textured than the plain around it. Shell fragments lie in a loose scatter. Bacteria spread in thin white crescents around the thicker seep points. The whole place has the look of something organizing itself from within. That is perhaps the deepest wonder of the oasis. No sunlight directs it. No season announces it. No tide paints it into visibility for the world above. It builds in private. The earth exhales, the bacteria answer, then the grazers, then the worms, then the shells that remain when one life gives way to another. A world made step by step beneath miles of black water. We drift past the little cluster and see the seam widen briefly ahead. The whitening of the mud grows stronger there, broad enough now that the line becomes a patch. And the patch begins to resemble the smallest edge of a field. Life responds immediately. More snails, a few more shrimp, and farther out, barely visible at first, another set of worm tubes, shorter than the first cluster, but enough to show that the seep's influence is spreading sideways as well as forward. The basin is changing shape again, not physically in some dramatic way. The mud remains low and calm, the darkness remains endless above us. But emotionally, the place is changing. It no longer feels like a lonely chamber marked by remnants and hints. It feels inhabited, not densely, not richly in the way of the older colonies we remember, but honestly, presently, as if the abyss itself has agreed to share this small stretch of silence with life. Perhaps that is the truest form of beauty in the toxic oasis, not abundance for its own sake, but transformation. The way a plain of dark sediment can become a living threshold simply because the hidden chemistry beneath it remains generous enough, long enough, for life to believe in it. We remain over the widening patch for a moment. The shrimp turn and hover. The snails continue their slow feeding. The worm plumes barely move in the current. Everything is restrained. Everything is enough. And then we go on, following the pale spread deeper through the basin. toward whatever larger gathering this new seep ground may still be preparing to become. We move on from the widening patch, and the basin carries us into another stretch of quiet transformation. The seep no longer feels fragile here. It still speaks softly, through pale bacteria, through altered mud, through the patient arrival of small creatures. But its softness has become steady. That steadiness changes everything. In the earlier parts of the basin, each pale patch felt like a question. Would life remain? Would the chemistry hold? Would the darkness reclaim the place before a colony could form? Here, the question has begun to fade. The bacterial film spreads across the sediment in broader shapes now. Not a great field, not yet, but enough to break the basin into living zones. Thin white bands connect to smoother patches. Brighter patches fade into darker seams. The whole floor begins to resemble a hidden map, slowly revealing itself beneath our light. And wherever that map brightens, life is waiting. Snails move in greater numbers across the film. Their paths are slow, almost meditative, as if they have all the time in the world. And here, in the deep, perhaps they do. A pair of shrimp hover close to the mud, lifting and settling with minute adjustments, keeping themselves near the richest ground. Then, farther ahead, a longer line of worm tubes appears. Not dense enough to form a forest, not tall enough to command the whole scene, but longer, more continuous, as though the seep has finally become reliable enough for life to begin drawing its first true boundary lines across the basin floor. We drift above them. Their pale tubes rise from the sediment with quiet conviction. Each red plume opens into the current like a small living ember in the dark. At their base, the mud is brightened by bacterial growth, and here and there shell fragments lie scattered between them. The place has crossed another threshold. This is no longer only a beginning. It is not yet a mature colony, but it has become something more than promise. A young district of the oasis is taking shape. That feeling settles over the whole scene. The darkness beyond remains immense, a cold and endless plain waiting on every side. But here, in this narrow band of enriched sediment, the abyss has been persuaded once again to make room for life, and life, as always, responds with patience rather than noise. There is no rush to fill the basin, no dramatic bloom, only the deep pattern repeated with quiet certainty. Chemistry below, bacteria above it, worms rising from that foundation, small grazers and drifters moving among them, shells beginning to remain behind as the first layers of memory. The toxic oasis builds itself the way deep time builds everything, through repetition, so gentle that it almost escapes notice. We follow the line of tubes farther on. In one place they thin again, in another they cluster more closely around a pale patch of film. That unevenness makes the colony feel alive in a truer way. Not perfect, not symmetrical, but responsive, growing wherever the seep offers enough. A small fish appears at the edge of our light. It does not enter the colony fully. It hovers near the darker boundary where enriched sediment fades back into open mud. Then, with one slow motion, it slips away again. Even now, the border between oasis and abyss remains important. Life concentrates where the hidden gift is strongest. Predators and wanderers test the margins. The open basin waits just beyond, but the center is strengthening. We pause over the longest stretch of tubes and bacterial film. Everything here is calm. The plumes barely sway. The shrimp turn in place. The snails continue their patient work. Nothing asks to be admired, nothing performs, and yet the beauty of it feels complete, not because it is large, not because it is bright, but because it shows with such quiet honesty how little life may need in order to begin changing a world. A thin seep, a stable patch of mud, a few faithful symbioses, and suddenly the basin is no longer only a basin, it is becoming home. Ahead, the pale ground seems to widen once more, and the line of worm tubes bends gently into darker water beyond our light. We continue after it, deeper into the growing settlement, while the black silence above remains as vast as ever and somehow less empty. We follow the bending line of worm tubes into darker water, and little by little the young settlement begins to feel more assured of itself. The bacterial film spreads wider here, not in one smooth blanket, but in connected patches, pale against the dark mud, each one marking where the buried chemistry still rises with enough strength to matter. Between those patches, open sediment remains, quiet, cold, waiting. That contrast gives the whole place its shape. This is not a crowded kingdom like the older seep grounds we passed before. It is something earlier than that, a growing district of the abyss, still arranging its boundaries, still deciding where life can stay and where the darkness must remain untouched. We drift lower over one broadened patch of white film. Its surface looks soft beneath the light, almost waxy, as if the basin has exhaled frost from within. Snails move across it in patient arcs. A shrimp hovers over the brightest edge, then turns and settles again near a seam in the sediment. At the center, several worm tubes rise close enough together that they no longer feel scattered. They feel rooted. That is the difference we have been traveling toward. Not merely life appearing, but life beginning to belong. The red plumes open gently into the water, each one drawing from the same hidden promise below. Inside the tubes, the invisible labor continues. Bacteria converting seeped chemicals into nourishment, worms holding that chemistry within living form. Again and again, the deep returns to this quiet miracle, that poison below the mud can become sustenance above it, that what would seem hostile from the surface becomes, here in the abyss, the foundation of a home. Around the cluster, shell fragments are easier to find now. Some lie half buried in the pale sediment, others rest against the tubes, like the first rough edges of a future bed. None are dense enough yet to suggest age in the grand sense, but they do suggest repetition. Creatures have lived here, fed here, remained long enough to leave something behind. The basin is learning continuity. We move slowly along the edge of the patch, and a new feeling settles over the place. Not abundance exactly, but rhythm. Patch, gap, cluster, seam, patch, gap, cluster again. The oasis is composing itself in sections, each one fed according to the patient logic of the seep below. Where the chemistry rises stronger, life thickens. Where it weakens, the settlement loosens. Where it pauses, the abyss returns. That rhythm makes the whole landscape feel alive in a deeper way than spectacle ever could. Nothing here is random. Nothing here is wasted. Every gathering is an answer to an invisible condition beneath the floor. Farther ahead, the worm line curves around a darker hollow in the mud. The bacterial film brightens along its rim, and for a moment, the place resembles a half-drawn circle, a boundary the seep is sketching from below. We lower toward it. Along the rim, more tubes rise, not tall, but more numerous than before. Their plumes hold steady in the current. Small snails work the pale ground between them. A shrimp lifts and vanishes into the dim water just beyond the colony's edge. The young settlement is no longer fragile in the way it once was. It still remains modest, still soft-spoken, but its presence is now undeniable. The abyss has been interrupted here, not loudly, not by force, but by patience. And as we hover over the pale ring and its careful inhabitants, watching the first real shape of a new seep ground emerge from the basin's quiet floor, it becomes clear that the toxic oasis is once again doing what it has always done, building a hidden world from the smallest faithful gifts of the earth. Ahead, beyond the ring, the pale sediment continues into darkness. The settlement is still growing, still deepening, still becoming. So, we follow. We follow the pale ring into the darkness beyond, and the farther we move, the more the young seep ground begins to feel like a place with its own quiet gravity. The bacterial film continues in widening strokes across the mud, not enough to erase the dark basin around it, but enough to draw the eye again and again toward the same hidden truth. The earth is still feeding this place. Along one brighter stretch, the sediment appears gently lifted, a low swelling in the floor, where chemistry has been rising for long enough to change the texture of the mud itself. The white film gathers there more thickly. Shell fragments lie in greater number, and between them, the worm tubes stand closer together. Not a forest, not yet, but no longer merely a scattered line. This is how a hidden world declares itself in the deep through closeness, through repetition, through life choosing the same few meters of darkness over and over, until the seafloor begins to carry the unmistakable feeling of settlement. We lower over the swelling patch. The tubes are pale and slender, their red plumes opening softly into the current. At their base, snails move across the bacterial film in patient loops. A shrimp hovers between two tubes, nearly still except for the faint corrections that keep it balanced over the enriched ground. Nothing here is hurried. Nothing needs to be. In the surface world, growth often looks dramatic. A bloom, a surge, a season arriving all at once. But the deep sea prefers another method. It builds by returning, by lingering, by letting one life settle, then another, until the place itself begins to remember what it has become. That memory is visible now. The shells scattered through the pale sediment are no longer only accidental remains. They are becoming structure, tiny anchors in the mud, the first rough layering of a future bed, the first signs that this seep has remained generous long enough for life to leave behind more than a passing trace. We drift along the edge of the swelling patch, and beyond it the bacterial film breaks into branching seams. White paths stretching outward into darker mud like the roots of some buried tree drawn in reverse. Each branch holds a slightly different promise. One remains thin and uncertain, another brightens enough to attract a few more snails. A third disappears into shadow, leaving only a faint, pale dusting on the sediment. The oasis is exploring itself. That is what it feels like here. Not a finished colony, but a living experiment in patience. The seep testing where it can hold, life answering where it can stay. Farther on, a second cluster of worm tubes rises near one of the branching seams, smaller than the first, but close enough to suggest that the young settlement is beginning to spread outward in more than one direction. This changes the whole emotional shape of the basin. What once felt like isolated signs, a patch here, a tube there, a few shells in dark mud, now feels connected. A growing network of quiet abundance, a pattern repeating itself with enough strength to be trusted. The open abyss still surrounds it on every side, black water above, smooth cold sediment beyond the pale ground. The old emptiness remains vast, and yet here, in this one branching seep field, life has begun to form something stronger than a foothold. It has begun to form continuity. We pause above the branching white seams, and the two worm clusters holding their separate little territories in the dark. The shrimp hover, the snails continue their soft work. The plumes barely sway, everything is restrained, everything is complete, and as we move onward, following the brightest branch deeper into the basin's hidden architecture, it feels as though we are no longer watching a place begin. We are watching it learn how to endure. We follow the brightest branch as it extends into the basin. And for the first time since entering this quieter region of the deep, the seep ground feels not fragile, but settled. Not old in the way of the buried shell mounds behind us, not crowded like the richer colonies from earlier in our descent, but settled enough that the darkness around it has changed its meaning. Here the pale bacterial film no longer looks like a question written over the mud. It looks like an answer. The white seam broadens as it runs forward, spreading into a smooth patch of enriched sediment. The edges remain soft and uneven, fading gently back into dark mud. But the center holds its brightness with quiet confidence. Along that center, worm tubes stand in a loose but unmistakable arrangement. Not random, not isolated, a small living district shaped by the hidden geometry of the seep below. Their pale bodies rise from the sediment like fine carved lines. Their red plumes open calmly into the current, carrying none of the urgency the surface world would expect from life. Everything here moves as though it already understands the pace of the abyss. At their base, shell fragments have become something more continuous, still not a true bed. Not yet, but enough to roughen the sea floor into texture and memory. Snails move across the bacterial film and over the shells alike, while small shrimp hover just above the brightest patches, remaining close to the chemistry that feeds the whole place. We drift slowly above the colony. Below us, the pale ground seems almost luminous against the dark basin floor. Not glowing, but carrying that faint, milk-white softness that turns the abyss into something less empty than it first appeared. This is what the toxic oasis does at its gentlest. It does not conquer the darkness, it edits it. A patch of white here, a cluster of tubes there, a scatter of shells, a few careful animals moving over enriched mud. And suddenly the black plain is no longer only black plain, it has become a place with inner order. The brightest part of the branch curves around a shallow depression. Bacteria gather thickly along its edge, and several more worm tubes rise there, slightly closer together than those behind us. The depression itself remains darker, its center less touched, as though the seep is shaping the ground in rings and margins, offering more to some places than others. That unevenness makes the whole colony feel alive in a deeper way. Nothing here has been arranged for beauty. Nothing has been placed for symmetry. And yet beauty emerges anyway, from repetition, from patience, from life's willingness to return again and again wherever the buried earth remains generous. A small fish lingers at the colony's outer edge, never fully entering the pale centre. It hangs in the dim water for a moment, then turns and disappears back toward the darker mud. Even now the border between oasis and abyss holds its old power. Inside the colony, life settles. At the margins, life tests. We continue along the branch and more shell fragments appear, some old and worn, others cleaner, newer, less claimed by sediment. The place is beginning to hold time in layers, not many layers yet, but enough to suggest that this seep ground has crossed a threshold. It is no longer simply becoming, it has begun to persist. And in the deep sea, persistence is its own kind of magnificence, not loud, not sudden, not shaped for admiration, only steady. Steady enough for bacteria to keep writing their pale script across the mud. Steady enough for worms to hold their red plumes in the dark. Steady enough for shells to remain after the living body is gone. Steady enough for the basin itself to remember. We pause above the shallow depression and its ring of white film one last time. The snails continue their patient movement. The shrimp hover. The worm plumes barely stir. All of it feels complete, in the quietest possible way. And as we drift onward along the brightened seam, deeper into this young but lasting district of the oasis, the lesson grows clearer. Life in the abyss does not need grandeur to become a world. It only needs enough time, enough chemistry, and enough faith in the darkness to stay. We move deeper into the young district, and everything ahead feels quieter still. Not emptier, not weaker, only more inward, as though the seep ground has led us away from its outer paths and into a calmer interior where life no longer needs to prove that it belongs. The pale bacterial film remains beneath us, broad in places, narrow in others, but always present enough. And as we move along that narrowing pale road through the basin's calm black floor, it becomes clear that the oasis is never truly still, even when all its creatures seem motionless. It is always reaching, always adjusting, always testing where life can remain. The deep sea does not grow quickly, but it never stops trying. We follow the narrowing seam as it reaches into darker ground, and the farther it goes, the more the whole basin begins to feel like a breath held gently in the dark. The broader pale patches behind us are gone now. The young district has softened into a quieter form. Not a settled centre, but a line of possibility stretching onward through the mud. The bacterial film remains visible along the seam, though thinner than before. It does not spread widely here. It clings close to the path of hidden chemistry below. A soft whitening of the sediment that appears, fades, and appears again, like thought itself moving through the floor of the sea. At intervals, worm tubes still rise from the pale line, not in clusters now, more often one at a time, sometimes two close together, then a long dark gap before the next. Each one feels deliberate, a marker of where the buried earth still gives enough. Their red plumes open into the water with the same quiet confidence as ever. No matter how small the seep point, no matter how lonely the patch of white around them, the old agreement holds: bacteria below, worm above, life within life. A hidden exchange repeated in silence. That repetition is strangely comforting. It suggests that even at the edges of the oasis, even where the colony stretches thin and the abyss presses close from every side, the same patient logic remains intact, the same rules, the same trust. We drift past one worm tube standing entirely alone beside a pale crescent of bacterial film. At its base, only 2 or 3 shell fragments rest in the mud. A snail moves across the whitened edge, nothing more. And yet the place does not feel empty. It feels complete, in miniature, as though the deep has taken the whole story of the oasis, microbes, chemistry, partnership, memory, and folded it into the smallest possible form. Perhaps that is another lesson of these hidden worlds, that greatness is not always scale. Sometimes it is pattern, sometimes it is the ability of life to repeat its meaning faithfully, even in the faintest and most fragile places. Ahead, the seam dips into a darker stretch of basin floor. The sediment there looks smoother, less interrupted, and for a while the pale film nearly disappears. We move on through that uncertainty. No worm tubes, no shells, only dark mud and the weight of black water above. For a moment it feels as though the oasis may have ended, but then the light catches a thin new whitening over the sediment, faint as breath on cold stone. A shrimp hovers there. One small snail works the edge of the film, and farther on, just visible in the dimness, another pair of worm tubes rises. The path continues. It always surprises us this way. Just when the basin seems ready to return to silence alone, life answers again, not with abundance, not with spectacle, only with enough. Enough bacteria to mark the mud, enough chemistry to hold a worm in place, enough continuity for the darkness to remain inhabited. We drift toward the next pair of tubes, the seam brightening slightly beneath them, and the whole basin seems to gather around that modest sign of persistence. The toxic oasis is stretching itself farther into the abyss, one quiet foothold at a time. And we follow, deeper into its patient reach. We move toward the next pair of worm tubes, and the closer we come, the more the darkness around them seems to soften. Not because the basin has grown brighter, not because the abyss has become smaller, but because even 2 living towers in the mud are enough to change the meaning of a place. The pale bacterial film beneath them is thin, almost delicate. A soft whitening over the sediment where the seep still reaches upward through hidden paths below. At the base of the tubes lie a few shell fragments half sunk into the mud, as if the first memories of this place are already beginning to settle. One small shrimp hovers nearby. A snail traces the edge of the white patch with slow certainty. It is a tiny world, and yet it holds the whole logic of the oasis within it. Chemistry rising in silence, microbes answering first, then the worms anchored by invisible partnerships within their own bodies. Then the smaller grazers, the shell remains, the first rough texture of continuity. Again and again, the deep sea builds from this same quiet pattern. We drift past the 2 tubes and follow the seam farther on. It bends slightly through the basin floor, no wider than a thought, appearing and disappearing under the light. Sometimes the white film gathers along it. Sometimes only a faint discoloration of the mud shows where the hidden gift below still lingers. The farther we go, the more the path feels like the final whisper of the seep, not ending yet, but narrowing into something very pure. A simple agreement between the earth and a few faithful forms of life. There is beauty in that narrowing. The older colonies we crossed before had their own wonder, their shell banks, their worm towers, their rich, pale fields. But here, at the thinner edge of the oasis, the meaning of the whole world becomes easier to see. Life does not need much, it only needs enough. Enough seepage, enough patience, enough time for one worm tube to become two, for two to become memory, for memory to remain in the mud until the next hidden beginning arrives. Ahead, the seam fades almost to nothing. For several long moments there is only dark sediment, smooth, level, and still beneath us. No visible bacteria, no shell fragments, no tubes, only the cold basin floor holding its silence. And in that silence it feels as though we have reached the farthest edge of the oasis, the last place where the buried earth still tried to speak before the open abyss reclaimed the mud entirely. Yet even here, the feeling is not one of defeat. It is gentler than that. What the oasis leaves behind is not emptiness, it leaves possibility. Traces in the sediment, subtle changes in chemistry, layers of shell and mineral that may one day support another, beginning somewhere nearby. The deep sea rarely closes a story with a hard line. It prefers fade-in margins, soft endings, continuities too patient for quick eyes to notice. At last, far ahead, the seafloor opens into broad, unmarked darkness once more. No pale seam leads onward, no living patch interrupts the basin floor. The oasis has reached its quiet limit. We hover there for a moment, between the last hidden signs of chemical life behind us and the great unbroken abyss before us. Above, miles of black water remain silent. Below, the mud says nothing, and yet everything we have seen still lingers in the shape of the place. The shell ruins, the bacterial fields, the young worm districts, the fading borderlands, the patient beginnings and endings written across the seafloor by chemistry and time. All of it remains with us now, as if the ocean has shown us not one place, but one of its oldest secrets. That even in total darkness, even in poison, even where life seems least likely to endure, the sea keeps making room, and slowly, very slowly, we begin to turn away from the basin's far edge, carrying with us the hush of those hidden oases, their pale sediments, their red plumes, their small, faithful creatures living where no sunlight has ever been. Behind us, the abyss closes softly over everything again, but not before leaving one last thought suspended in the dark, that the deepest world is not empty, it is only hidden. Now we rise, not quickly, not all at once, but with the same slow surrender that carried us down into the basin in the first place. Below us, the far edge of the oasis begins to fall away. The last faint seams of pale sediment soften into darkness. The final worm tubes disappear. The shell traces vanish into the mud. And yet, the hidden world does not feel gone. It feels folded back into itself, returned to the silence that has protected it for so long. That may be the most beautiful thing about the toxic oases of the deep sea. They do not need to be seen in order to exist. They do not depend on witness. They bloom in secrecy. They endure in darkness. They remain faithful to their quiet work, whether any eye ever reaches them or not. As we drift upwards, a basin floor grows dimmer beneath us. The ridges, fields, and seep lines we followed become only suggestion, then memory. But what stays clear is the pattern. The buried earth exhales, bacteria answer, worms rise, shells remain. A colony blooms, a colony fades. Another begins nearby, again and again, across the abyss, across centuries, across distances no sunlight can cross. It is a softer kind of eternity, not permanence but renewal. Not one garden lasting forever, but many hidden gardens appearing wherever the chemistry of the planet allows a little life to gather. Perhaps that is why these places feel so dreamlike. They do not belong to the ordinary logic of the surface. No dawn reaches them. No weather passes over them. No green world feeds them in the way we expect. And still they live. Not despite the darkness, but through it. Not despite the poison, but by transforming it. Not despite the silence, but with the patience that silence teaches. Far below, the oasis is gone now from sight. Only black water remains between us and the basin floor, a rising emptiness, a cold and endless distance. But we know better now than we did before. We know that emptiness is not always empty. We know that darkness is not always barren. We know that even the most hidden places of the sea can hold fields, settlements, ruins, and beginnings, whole quiet worlds built from chemistry and trust. Marine snow drifts around us as we ascend, tiny particles falling through the water like the softest possible weather. Each one glimmers for a moment in our light, before fading into black again. There is something comforting in that descent of particles while we rise, the surface still sending its distant remains downward, the deep still holding its own buried sources below, and between them, the long, silent water column, carrying both memory and hunger through the night of the sea. We rise farther. Somewhere above, far beyond sight, waits the world of waves and wind and sunlight, a world of quick motion, a world of bright hours, a world that often forgets how much life can happen in secret. But below, beneath all of that brightness, the toxic oases continue, the seaplines, the bacterial films, the shell beds and worm towers, the fragile beginnings, the fading margins, the patient, hidden districts of the abyss, they continue without us. And that feels right. Some wonders do not ask to be possessed, only understood, gently, for a little while. So, we leave them there, in the cold breath of the buried earth, in the pressure of eternal night, in the calm dark where life learned to feed on what the world above would call impossible. And as we keep rising, the last thought the basin gives us is simple, that the ocean is older than our fears, more patient than our imagination, and kinder, perhaps, in its strangest depths than we ever knew. Because even there, where poison seeps through mud and no sunrise has ever fallen, it still makes room for living things to gather close, to endure, to build small hidden worlds, and to rest together in the dark. We continue to rise through the dark water, slowly leaving the hidden basin behind. There is no final sound from below. No closing sign, no last dramatic revelation from the seafloor, only distance, the kind of distance the deep sea knows better than any place on earth. Distance layered in pressure, distance carried in silence, distance so complete that whole worlds can bloom beneath it and remain unknown for ages. And yet, after what we have seen, the darkness no longer feels empty. It feels inhabited in memory. Somewhere, far below, bacterial mats still spread their pale frost across the mud. Worm plumes still open softly into black water. Small snails still cross the whitened seams where chemistry reaches the surface. Old shell mounds still hold the shape of vanished colonies. Young seaplines still test the basin for new beginnings. All of it continues without hurry, without witness, without needing the surface world to understand. Perhaps that is what makes these oases so peaceful in the end. They belong entirely to themselves. The deep sea does not explain them. It does not decorate them for our comfort. It simply keeps them far below the reach of weather and daylight, where life and chemistry speak in their own ancient language. As we drift upward, the water around us seems softer now, still black, still cold, but no longer severe, because we know what lies beneath that darkness. Not monsters waiting in emptiness, but communities. Not death ruling the basin floor, but transformation. Not silence as absence, but silence as shelter. The toxic oases have changed the meaning of the abyss. They have shown us that the sea's deepest places are not only regions of pressure and isolation, they are also places of invention, places where life found another way, places where poison became nourishment, where hidden gases became gardens, where the buried breath of the earth became enough for small, faithful worlds to endure. Far above, a very faint softness begins to gather in the water, not true light yet. Only the first suggestion that we are rising back toward layers the sun can touch. Below, the basin has disappeared completely, but the feeling of it remains. The pale fields, the shell ruins, the young worm districts, the thin, fading seams at the far edge of the oasis. All of it drifts with us now, like a dream we do not want to break too suddenly. And perhaps that is fitting, because the deep sea itself feels like a dream the planet has been having for millions of years. A dark dream of chemistry and patience, a dream in which life did not wait for comfort, a dream in which even the harshest places could become home. We rise farther still, the water begins to loosen, the darkness thins by a fraction, the memory of the surface returns, waves, air, sky. But some part of us lingers below, with the worm plumes opening in black water, with the bacteria writing their pale script across the mud, with the quiet hidden settlements that bloom where no sunrise has ever reached. And before we leave that world completely, one final truth settles over everything we have seen. The ocean is never only what appears on its surface. Beneath every wave, beneath every blue horizon, beneath every calm, shining day, there may be older kingdoms waiting in the dark, kingdoms built not from light, but from endurance, not from beauty, as we usually name it, but from patience, from partnership, from the stubborn tenderness of life refusing to disappear. So, let the basin rest now, let the shell beds sleep beneath their layers of sediment, let the pale seams continue their hidden work, let the toxic oases of the deep sea remain where they have always been, far below, quietly alive, turning darkness into refuge and poison into one more cradle for life. And as we return toward the upper ocean, toward softer water, and the distant memory of day, the abyss offers no farewell. It does not need one. It has already given us its secret, that even in the deepest dark, life can still gather, still endure, still dream in silence beneath the sea. And now, as the ocean slowly closes above those hidden worlds, we rise gently back toward the surface, carrying with us the silence of the abyss, the pale oases of the deep, and the quiet reminder that life can endure even in darkness. If this journey helped you relax, you can softly support the channel by liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to drift with us again through more hidden oceans, forgotten depths, and quiet mysteries beneath the sea, you can subscribe to Unseen Ocean History and return whenever you need another peaceful descent. Until then, rest gently, breathe slowly, and let the deep carry you into sleep.